Hey there, tonight we're uncovering the art of a Viking shipbuilder's day. What you're about to discover is that these master craftsmen created their legendary longships not through sheer brute force, but through a delicate dance of precision and expertise. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now get comfortable, perhaps dim the lights, or find that perfect pillow position, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're jolted awake by the brisk Scandinavian breeze sneaking through the gaps in your turf-roofed longhouse. Welcome to 900 AD, where the alarm clock is Mother Nature, and the duvet is a hefty woolen blanket that's seen better days. As a Viking shipbuilder, you've got a busy day ahead, and trust me, it's not all pillaging and plundering, though that's the glamorous bit everyone wants to hear about. Nope, today, it's all about the less romantic, but absolutely vital, shipbuilding. Now, let's shake off the morning chill because you're living in a Norse society where ships are like the Teslas of the Viking Age. They're status symbols, economic lifelines, and military powerhouses all rolled into one. No dragon-headed ship. Forget about being taken seriously. Your work isn't just about slapping some wood together. It's crafting the very backbone of Viking society. And speaking of wood, let's talk materials. Your go-to options are oak and pine. Oak for its strength and durability, and pine for its lighter weight and ease of shaping. The oak is your tank, and the pine is your Ferrari. You need both to create a ship that can handle the North Sea's mood swings. But here's the kicker. Acquiring these materials is no stroll down to your local Home Depot. Nope, you're setting off on a mini-saga just to gather resources. Oak doesn't grow in the backyard. It's found in dense forests that could be hundreds of kilometers away. So, you've got to plan expeditions to chop down these towering giants, involving a good chunk of your community. It's not just about the tree cutting either. You'll need manpower to haul these timber behemoths back to the shipyard, a process that could take weeks. And as if nature wasn't challenging enough, there's the little detail of cost. Trees don't come free, even back in the Viking Age. The price of timber could be akin to buying a modern-day sports car, especially if you're importing it from places like Ireland or Scotland. Let's just say that your average Viking family didn't have that kind of money lying around. While you're sipping on some hearty porridge, no bacon and eggs here, sorry. You contemplate the logistics of today's tasks. Each log must be painstakingly carved into the perfect shape, using tools like axes, adzes, and chisels. These aren't your garden variety tools either. They're crafted with precision and passed down generations, each carrying the legacy of your forebears' craftsmanship. Every stroke of the axe is a nod to your ancestors and a promise of seaworthy adventures to come. And let's not forget the iron nails, or rather, the lack thereof. Iron is a precious commodity, so you'll be using wooden pegs to piece the ship together. Efficient, eco-friendly, and a nightmare if you lose one in the workshop's sawdust. As you head to the shipyard, you're reminded that your work is not merely a trade, it's a vital cog in the Viking economy. Ships are the beating heart of commerce, allowing your people to trade amber, furs, and walrus ivory far and wide. Without these vessels, you might as well be landlocked and penniless. Not to mention, ships are your ticket to new worlds and opportunities. They are the reason Leif Erikson could later stumble upon North America, long before Columbus ever dreamed of sailing the ocean blue. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Your job today is to ensure that your ship won't sink before it reaches its first port. Navigating the political waters is just as tricky as handling the physical ones. In a society where warrior chiefs rule with a mix of charisma and brute force, your craftsmanship is your currency. A well-made ship can elevate your standing, earn you favor with the chieftains, and maybe even a share in future spoils. Fail, and you might find yourself on the wrong end of a berserker's axe. No pressure. So, as the sun climbs higher in the sky, casting its golden light over the fjords, you start your day in the shipyard, surrounded by the rich scent of fresh-cut wood and the rhythmic clanging of tools. It's a symphony of industry and ambition. Not a bad way to spend a day in the Viking Age, if you ask me. But remember, this is just the start. By the time the sun sets, you'll have navigated an ocean of challenges, each plank a step closer to the horizon. As the sun casts its golden light over the fjords, painting the shipyard in hues of ambition and possibility, you find yourself amidst the clamor of hammers and the scent of fresh timber. This is where the magic, or rather, the gritty, sweat-drenched reality of Viking shipbuilding takes place. Forget the romantic notion of hulking brutes swinging axes willy-nilly. What you're about to witness is a masterclass in craftsmanship that would make even the most seasoned artisan nod in admiration. So, let's dive into the toolbox of a Viking shipbuilder. And no, it's not some mythical chest filled with enchanted gear. It's a collection of deceptively simple instruments that your average DIY enthusiast might scoff at, yet their effectiveness is nothing short of legendary. First up, the axe, as iconic to the Viking as the sword is to the samurai. But this isn't your run-of-the-mill firewood chopper. The broad axe used here is a precision instrument, finely honed to create the long, smooth planks that form the hull of a ship. Archaeological finds from sites like the Garkstead ship reveal that these axes were so sharp they could shave the bark off a tree faster than you can say Ragnar Lothbrok. Next, the adze, an unsung hero that looks like a cross between a hoe and an axe. It's perfect for smoothing and shaping wood, giving the ship its hydrodynamic curves. The adze is the Michelangelo of the Viking toolkit, transforming rough timber into sleek planks that cut through water like a hot knife through butter. Then there's the humble chisel, indispensable for the finer details. It's what allows you to carve intricate designs into the ship, turning a functional vessel into a floating work of art. Because let's face it, if your ship isn't as eye-catching as it is seaworthy, you might as well be paddling a canoe. And let's not overlook the humble saw, the unsung hero of the Viking age, wielded with the kind of precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep. These tools, often passed down through generations, carry the legacy of your ancestors' craftsmanship. They are your brushes, and the ship is your canvas. But here's the kicker. This level of craftsmanship wasn't just a labor of love. It was a necessity. Viking society thrived on seafaring, and a poorly built ship could mean the difference between a successful raid, trade mission, and a watery grave. Now, let's talk about the Garkstead ship, one of the most famous archaeological finds that showcase Viking ingenuity. Unearthed in Norway in 1880, this 9th century beauty is a testament to the precision and skill of its builders. Measuring 23, 8 meters in length and 2 meters in width, it's not just a ship, it's a floating fortress. The keel, that central spine of the ship, was crafted from a single oak trunk, a feat requiring such precision that it might make a modern engineer break into a cold sweat. The Garkstead ship's clinker-built design, overlapping planks fastened with iron rivets, was revolutionary. It allowed for flexibility and strength, enabling the ship to withstand the North Sea's infamous tantrums. The hull was so perfectly balanced and streamlined that it could reach speeds of up to 15 knots under sail. That's around 17 mph, faster than a modern cruise ship. And all this with a crew of just 72 burly Vikings, each one likely more comfortable wielding a sword than a sail, yet here they were, masters of both. Now, about those iron rivets. It's easy to romanticize them as the backbone of Viking shipbuilding, but the truth is, they were more of a luxury than a staple. Iron was scarce and expensive, often imported from the British Isles, and its use had to be strategic. That's where wooden pegs, or tree nails, came in handy. These wooden fasteners were the unsung heroes of the shipbuilding process, ensuring the planks held tight without the need for costly metal. Eco-friendly before it was cool, right? But let's bust another myth while we're at it. The idea that Vikings were mere raiders, running amok through Europe with nothing but plunder on their minds. Sure, they had their moments of pillaging glory. Hello, Lindisfarne. But they were also traders, explorers, and yes, skilled craftsmen. The precision involved in constructing a longship like the Garkstead is a testament to that. It required not only physical strength, but also an understanding of mathematics, engineering, and hydrodynamics. These were not just boats. They were the Concords of their time, cutting-edge technology that symbolized power, prestige, and possibility. And in a society where your ship could make or break your reputation, the stakes were high. A well-crafted ship could earn you favor with the chieftains, a spot in the most lucrative trading routes, or even a share in the spoils of war. On the flip side, a shoddy vessel could see you swimming with the fish, or worse, at the mercy of your fellow Vikings, who weren't exactly known for their patience. So as you stand there, surrounded by the clanging symphony of industry, and the lingering scent of pine and oak, take a moment to appreciate the monumental task before you. Each plank you shape, every nail you drive is a step toward the horizon, a chance to carve your name into the annals of history, not as a marauder, but as a master craftsman. And as the sun begins its descent, casting long shadows over the shipyard, you know that today, like every day, you're not just building a ship, you're building a legacy. Stay tuned, though, because there's more to this story than just wood and waves. Midday rolls around, and the shipyard is buzzing like a beehive on a caffeine high. You're not alone in this endeavor. The entire community has a stake in what you're crafting. Viking society is like a well-oiled machine, where everyone has a role to play, from the jarl sipping mead to the thrall fetching timber. Think of it as a medieval startup, where collaboration isn't just encouraged, it's essential for survival. At the top of the Viking ladder sits the jarl, the big cheese of the community, whose word is as binding as the iron rivets you'd love to have more of. When a jarl commissions a ship, it's not just about flexing his power or planning the next raid. It's a strategic move in the chess game of Norse geopolitics. A new ship can shift the balance of power, expand trade routes, or intimidate rivals. Imagine commissioning a battleship today, same vibe, just with more dragons and fewer guided missiles. The jarl's interest in your shipbuilding skills isn't merely a passing fancy, it's an investment. If your ship can outpace the competition on the high seas, means more goods traded, more spoils gained, and more power concentrated in the jarl's hands. It's a win-win, as long as you don't botch the build and end up as shark bait. And let's not forget, a jarl with a fleet is a jarl who can defend his lands and people. No pressure, right? Beneath the jarl, you've got the carls, the free farmers and craftsmen who are the backbone of the Viking economy. These guys are your middle management, the ones who keep the gears turning. They're skilled laborers, and their expertise is crucial when you're trying to turn raw logs into a seafaring masterpiece. They're the ones swinging axes, shaping planks, and occasionally arguing over the best way to waterproof a hull. Spoiler, it involves a lot of tar and a fair bit of elbow grease. And then there are the thralls, the unfree laborers, often prisoners of war or born into servitude. While their work might not be glamorous, it's indispensable. They haul timber, prepare materials, and generally get their hands dirty so the rest of the operation can run smoothly. It's a tough gig, but without them, you'd have a lot more heavy lifting to do yourself. This isn't a society that believes in wasted potential. Everyone has a part to play, whether they like it or not. Now, let's talk politics, or as the Vikings might have called it, the art of not getting stabbed in the back. In a world where alliances are as fragile as an eggshell on a tightrope, the right ship can be your ticket to maintaining peace or waging war. When a jarl commissions your work, it's not just a nod to your skills, it's a declaration of intent. It's a way of saying, look at what I can do. You want to mess with this? It's the Norse equivalent of parking a tank on your lawn. In this communal hubbub, there's also a sense of camaraderie that transcends social status. Building a ship is a communal effort, and the bonds formed over blisters and sawdust are as sturdy as the ship you're crafting. You might not all be equal in status, but you're united in purpose. It's a bit like a Viking potluck, where everyone brings something to the table, except here, the stakes are a bit higher than who brought the best casserole. But let's not romanticize too much. This isn't a Cumbria moment in a meadow. The Viking Age is a brutal era, and the stakes are high, both figuratively and literally. Failure isn't just a personal embarrassment, it's a potential death sentence. If your ship doesn't hold up in a storm, it's not just your reputation on the line. It's the lives of everyone on board, from the jarl down to the lowliest thrall. That's a level of pressure most of us can only imagine. But why does any of this matter? Well, because in Norse society, a ship isn't just a means of transportation. It's a microcosm of the world around it. It reflects the social order, the economic priorities, and the political dynamics of the time. It's a floating symbol of what the Vikings valued: strength, exploration, and the ability to adapt to whatever the sea throws your way. So, as you stand there, the salty breeze mixing with the scent of sawdust, you can almost feel the weight of history on your shoulders. Each plank you shape isn't just for today's voyage. It's a foundation for the future, a legacy that will sail across time. And in a world where nothing is guaranteed except the sea's fickle nature, that's a legacy worth crafting. But hey, don't put away those tools yet. There's still plenty of daylight left, and the horizon's calling. Stay tuned, because the story of the Viking shipbuilder is far from over. As the afternoon sun dips toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the bustling shipyard, it's time to shift gears and dig into the economic powerhouse that Viking ships truly were. You see, these vessels were more than just wave-cutting beauties designed to terrify coastal communities. They were the lifeblood of a vast, pulsating trade network that stretched from the chilly shores of the British Isles to the sun-kissed markets of the Middle East. That's right, Vikings weren't just swinging axes, they were swinging deals, and the longship was their golden ticket to an interconnected world. Now, let's tackle a persistent myth. The notion of Vikings as lone wolves, isolated warriors with tunnel vision focused solely on conquest. Sure, the image of a horned helmet and a battle cry is thrilling, but it's about as accurate as using a selfie stick to capture the grandeur of the Northern Lights. The reality: Vikings were pioneers of globalization before globalization was a thing. Picture this. It's the year 900 AD, and Viking longships are skimming across the North Sea faster than a Norse myth can spread. These ships were the original high-speed internet, connecting distant shores in a web of commerce that would make even modern traders nod in appreciation. The sleek, double-ended design of a longship wasn't just for show. It was an engineering marvel that allowed for swift beach landings and quick getaways, a feature that came in handy whether you were trading or raiding. Typical longship could cover up to 100 miles a day, powered by the relentless rowing of its crew or the gusty Scandinavian winds filling its sails. And speaking of trade, let's talk goods. Vikings weren't just hawking furs and amber like medieval door-to-door salesmen. Nope, their inventory was as diverse as a modern-day megamall. From the silver coins of the Abbasid Caliphate to the fine silks of Byzantium, Viking traders had access to the luxury items of the era. They were the Amazon Prime of the Viking Age, minus the 2-day shipping, of course. You might wonder, what could the Vikings possibly have that was so desirable? Well, besides their legendary charm and intimidating presence, they had natural resources in spades. Furs from the northern forests, walrus ivory from the icy waters of Greenland, and the ever-precious amber from the Baltic coast. These were the bitcoins of their day, fetching high prices in distant markets. In return, they brought back spices, wine, and textiles, turning their Scandinavian homesteads into treasure troves of exotic goods. But it wasn't just about the stuff. Viking ships were cultural conduits, bringing back more than just physical goods. With every journey, these seafaring Norsemen absorbed new ideas, technologies, and cultural practices, spreading them like wildfire through their own communities. Imagine the cultural exchange that happened when a Viking trader sat down with an Arab merchant over a cup of mint tea, discussing navigation techniques or the latest fashion trends in Baghdad. It was a melting pot of ideas as vibrant as any modern city. And let's not forget the economic ripple effect of all this trading. Viking ships didn't just enrich the Jarls and the Carls, they lifted entire communities. Ports like Hedeby and Birka became bustling trade hubs, akin to medieval Wall Streets, where deals were struck and fortunes made. These towns grew into cosmopolitan centers, attracting traders from all corners of the known world. It was like a medieval version of The Sims, where trade routes, strategic alliances, and economic prowess determined whether your settlement thrived or withered. However, navigating these trade networks wasn't all smooth sailing and sunny skies. The Vikings had to contend with geopolitical realities that would make a modern diplomat break out in hives. Relationships with neighboring states were as unpredictable as the North Sea's weather, requiring a blend of diplomacy and occasionally a show of brute force. One minute you're trading with the Franks, the next you're fending off a Saxon reprisal raid. It's little wonder that Viking traders were often as skilled with a sword as they were with a balance sheet. Now, let's delve into one of the most fascinating aspects of Viking trade, the eastern routes. While the western voyages to the British Isles and beyond get most of the spotlight, the eastern trade routes were equally significant. Traveling down rivers like the Dnieper and Volga, Vikings reached the bustling markets of Constantinople and the opulent courts of the Abbasid Caliphate. Here, they were known as the Varangians, and their presence was so influential that they even formed the elite Varangian Guard for the Byzantine emperors. Not too shabby for a bunch of seafaring warriors from the frosty north, eh? And if you think that's impressive, consider this. Archaeological finds, such as the famous Viking hoard discovered in Cudale, England, revealed treasures from as far afield as Samarkand and Baghdad. This wasn't just a case of a few adventurous souls wandering off. It was a systematic, organized network of trade that spanned continents. It's like finding an iPhone in the ruins of Pompeii. Unexpected, but a testament to the reach and influence of Viking traders. As the afternoon sun begins its descent, casting golden hues over the fjords, you can almost sense the anticipation in the air. Each ship crafted in the yard is a potential voyage, a new chapter in the ongoing saga of Norse exploration and economic expansion. These ships weren't just carrying goods, they were carrying the dreams and ambitions of an entire people. And in a world where the sea was both a highway and an adversary, those dreams were as bold as they were necessary. In the grand chessboard of Viking geopolitics, the longship was both a rook and a queen, versatile and powerful. It was a tool of conquest, but also of connection, bridging cultures and continents in a way few had imagined. So, while the image of the marauding Viking warrior remains seared into our collective consciousness, it's worth remembering the other side of the coin. These were people as complex and multifaceted as the ships they built, traders, explorers, and yes, on occasion, raiders. But above all, they were pioneers of their time, navigating the uncharted waters of both the sea and human interaction. And as the shadows lengthen and the shipyard begins to quiet, you're left with a sense of awe at the sheer audacity of it all. The Vikings weren't just building ships, they were building the future, one plank at a time. But don't wander off just yet. There's still more to uncover in the saga of these master shipbuilders, and the horizon is calling. Stay tuned for the next chapter, where we'll delve even deeper into the legacies left behind by these intrepid Norse adventurers. As the shadows grow longer and the shipyard falls into a tranquil lull, it's the perfect moment to reflect on the legacy of Viking shipbuilding. You see, while the image of a Viking longship cutting through stormy seas might stir something primal in us, like the thrill of an action movie, there's far more to the story than the Hollywood version lets on. Viking ships weren't just about daring raids and epic voyages. They were the linchpins of a society that thrived on innovation, skilled labor, and a bit of good old-fashioned Norse ingenuity. First off, let's talk craftsmanship. Viking shipbuilders were like the rock stars of their time, minus the leather pants and questionable haircuts. Their work was a testament to the high level of skill required to produce vessels capable of withstanding the North Sea's mood swings. We're talking about master artisans who could turn a hulking oak trunk into a sleek, seaworthy craft using tools as rudimentary as axes and adzes. It's as if they were building Ferraris with nothing but a Swiss Army knife and a roll of duct tape. Now, here's the kicker. The romanticized image of Vikings as mere marauders is about as accurate as a weather forecast in 9th century Scandinavia. These folks were more than just muscle and fury. They were the Silicon Valley of the medieval world, constantly adapting and innovating. They perfected the clinker-built design, where overlapping planks created a flexible yet sturdy hull. It was a stroke of genius that allowed their ships to flex with the waves rather than fight against them, reducing the risk of a watery grave. This wasn't just a technical marvel. It was a lifesaver when you're navigating the temperamental North Atlantic. Let's pivot to the social dynamics for a moment, because Viking society was like a complex web of interdependent relationships. It wasn't just about the chieftains calling the shots. It was a community effort where every hand was crucial. The shipbuilders, the sailors, the traders, all of them played a part in sustaining the Norse way of life. This was a society that needed every cog in the machine to function smoothly, from the high-ranking jarls to the humble thralls. You could say it was the ultimate team project, where failing to pull your weight could mean the difference between a successful voyage and a one-way trip to Davy Jones' Larker. And let's not overlook the economic impact. Viking ships turned the Norsemen into maritime moguls, their vessels serving as both cargo haulers and conduits for cultural exchange. They weren't just importing goods, they were importing ideas, technologies, and even new ways of thinking. This wasn't just trade, it was a cultural revolution on water. Ports like Hedeby and Birka became bustling metropolises, akin to medieval versions of Wall Street, where fortunes were made, and the world was a little less vast. As we bring this saga to a close, it's worth noting that our understanding of Viking life is still evolving, thanks to modern archaeology. Every new discovery, from the wreck of the Oseberg ship to the treasures of the Cudale hoard, adds another piece to the puzzle, reshaping our perceptions of these seafaring warriors. Take the recent find in Jelestad, Norway, where ground-penetrating radar revealed a Viking ship buried under a farmer's field. It's a reminder that history is never static. It's a living, breathing narrative that continues to unfold. These archaeological gems are the time capsules of Viking innovation, telling us stories of craftsmanship and culture that words alone struggle to convey. They remind us that the Vikings weren't just pirates with a penchant for pillaging. They were pioneers of their time, blazing trails across the seas and leaving an indelible mark on history. Their ships were the engines of their age, propelling them into the annals of legend and lore. So, as the day winds down and you stand amid the quiet of the shipyard, it's hard not to feel a sense of awe at what the Vikings achieved. They took the raw elements of their harsh environment and crafted vessels of unparalleled beauty and utility, vessels that carried not just warriors, but the very essence of their culture and society. The legacy of these master shipbuilders is etched into the wood of every plank and the stories of every voyage. It's a legacy of innovation, resilience, and exploration, a testament to what humans can achieve when we dare to look beyond the horizon. As the last light of day fades, casting a warm glow over the fjords, you can almost hear the echoes of their oars cutting through the water, each stroke a beat in the symphony of history. The Vikings were more than their myths. They were architects of a world that was as interconnected as it was expansive. And as we sail into our own futures, perhaps there's a lesson to be learned from these intrepid Norse adventurers, that the greatest journeys start with the courage to set sail into the unknown, guided by the stars and fueled by the dreams of those who dare to build them. 1,000 years ago, while Europe was fumbling through the Middle Ages, tripping over its own feudal shoelaces, the Chola dynasty in southern India was busy setting the world stage for monumental architecture and economic prowess. Between the 9th and 13th centuries, the Cholas were the rock stars of their time. But instead of shredding guitars, they sculpted stone temples so grand that even the deities inside probably did a double take, talking about a dynasty that could rival a modern-day Fortune 500 company with its sheer economic clout and military might. But let's not get too starry-eyed just yet. First, let's dive into the wealth of the Cholas, their secret to success. Trade routes as intricate as a soap opera plot, and agriculture so advanced it could make a modern farmer blush. Situated in Tamil Nadu, the Cholas had the advantage of fertile lands and a strategic coastline. They didn't just rely on the predictable monsoon rains. No, they engineered an extensive irrigation system that would make any civil engineer nod in approval. This mastery over water meant rice paddies stretching as far as the eye could see, translating to full granaries and overflowing treasures. But it wasn't just about rice and grain. The Cholas were savvy traders, too, casting their nets wide into the Indian Ocean and beyond. Their ships, often described as floating palaces, weren't just for show. These vessels carried Chola influence and goods across Southeast Asia to as far as China. Pepper, pearls, textiles, you name it, were packed and shipped in exchange for gold and exotic imports. It's no exaggeration to say that the Chola Navy was the ancient equivalent of Amazon Prime, with a little more flair and a lot less two-day delivery. Speaking of flair, the Cholas were not just economic dynamos, but also military juggernauts. Their navy was the pride of the empire, reportedly consisting of over 600 ships. Now, in a world where some kingdoms struggled to keep a dozen in working order, the Cholas' maritime muscle was nothing short of extraordinary. They were like the Spartan Navy on steroids, minus the questionable historical accuracy of their abs. But before you start picturing them as benevolent rulers in their golden ships, let's peel back the curtain on some of their less-than-noble strategies. The Cholas had a foreign policy that could best be described as aggressive networking. They didn't just make friends, they conquered them. Under King Rajaraja Chola I, the empire expanded its reach by conquering neighboring kingdoms and demanding tribute. Rajendra Chola I, his successor, took it a step further by launching naval expeditions as far as the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian archipelago. It wasn't about spreading peace and love. It was about flexing imperial muscles and establishing economic dominance. Think of it as the ancient version of a corporate takeover, only with more swords and fewer shareholder meetings. The romanticized notion of the Cholas as benevolent rulers is a comforting bedtime story, but the reality was far more complex. They were shrewd politicians, masters of propaganda before Instagram made it cool. Temples were not just places of worship, but also centers of power and control. The massive structures were commissioned to flaunt wealth and divine favor. And let's not forget the land grants to Brahmin communities, a slick move that secured religious support and quashed dissent faster than you can say politically savvy. So, while the Cholas did indeed contribute to art and culture with their stunning temples and patronage of the Tamil language, they were also ruthless in their pursuit of power. It's a tale as old as time. Behind every grand empire lies a trail of strategic alliances, and sometimes a little bloodshed. But hey, nobody said building an empire was easy. As the sun set on the Chola dynasty in the 13th century, their legacy was etched in stone. Literally, the temples they built still stand, whispering tales of a bygone era where architecture was not just about aesthetics, but about showcasing a kingdom's might. These stone giants are a testament to the Cholas' vision, their ambition, and yes, their audacity. In the end, the Cholas were much like their temples, grand, intricate, and full of stories that continue to capture the imagination. They remind us that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a tapestry woven with human ambition, cunning, and creativity. And let's be honest, a little drama never hurt anyone. And speaking of temples, let's dig deeper into the colossal wonders the Cholas left behind. These aren't just places of worship. They are the rock concerts of ancient architecture, loud, proud, and impossible to ignore. Take the Brihadiswara temple in Thanjavur, for instance, commissioned by Rajaraja Chola I, completed in 1010 CE. Now, if you think building a Lego set is challenging, try assembling over 130,000 tons of granite into a tower reaching 216 feet high without cranes or modern machinery. It's like watching someone build the Death Star with just a chisel and sheer willpower. Why such grandeur, you ask? Well, it's the ancient version of keeping up with the Joneses, except the Joneses were other powerful dynasties, and the stakes were a bit higher than neighborhood envy. The Cholas were competing for divine brownie points and earthly bragging rights. A temple wasn't just a spiritual haven, it was a billboard screaming, "We're not just rich, we're divinely favored." The towering Vimanas, or temple towers, weren't just designed to scrape the sky. They were intended to scrape the heavens themselves. Now, let's not get too starstruck by the divine ambitions without acknowledging the architectural genius involved. The Cholas were like the Steve Jobs of their time, pushing the boundaries of what's possible. The Brihadiswara temple's Vimana is made of interlocking stones, a technique so precise it makes modern engineering look like child's play. And the crowning glory, a massive stone weighing about 80 tons perched at the top, hauled up a specially constructed ramp that stretched for miles. No helicopters, just pure, old-school muscle and ingenuity. It's the kind of feat that makes building a pyramid look like assembling IKEA furniture. But why stop at one temple when you can have a few dozen? The Cholas were prolific temple builders, each more majestic than the last. It was a never-ending game of one-upmanship. Every ruler wanted their own slice of architectural immortality, and they didn't just stop at size. These temples were adorned with sculptures so intricate they'd make Michelangelo's David look like a stick figure. Each carving was a story, a sermon in stone, depicting everything from divine tales to royal exploits. Every panel was an Instagram post carved in granite, capturing the essence of their times. Let's not forget the economic engine that powered this divine architecture. Building these temples wasn't just about devotion, it was about displaying economic might. The Cholas had the resources, thanks to their bustling trade networks and agricultural wealth. These temples were not just stone and mortar, but the very embodiment of the empire's prosperity. They were the ancient equivalent of a billionaire's art collection. Only these were open to the public and came with a side of spiritual enlightenment. But here's the kicker. While these temples were grand displays of piety, they were also centers of power and control. They were the bank vaults of their time, holding treasures, land grants, and even political influence. The priests running these temples were as much power brokers as they were spiritual guides. It was a neat little package of religion, politics, and commerce all rolled into one sprawling complex. And the Cholas were the masters of this game, making sure their name was synonymous with divine favor and earthly dominance. Now, let's bust a myth or two while we're at it. The romantic notion is that these temples were built purely out of devotion. But the reality, it's a tad more pragmatic. Sure, the Cholas were devout, but they were also shrewd. These temples were as much about securing political alliances and social control as they were about religious expression. Land grants to temples ensured loyalty from Brahmin communities, which in turn maintained social order. It was a win-win, unless you were on the receiving end of a Chola conquest, in which case it was more win-lose. Even the deities housed within these temples weren't just spiritual icons, they were political allies. Each deity was a representation of the ruler's power and legitimacy. The gods were co-opted into the Chola PR machine, providing divine endorsement to earthly rule. It's the ancient equivalent of a celebrity endorsement, only these celebrities had celestial clout. While we marvel at these architectural wonders today, it's worth remembering the complex interplay of faith, politics, and economy that birthed them. The Chola temples stand not just as monuments to divine devotion, but as testaments to human ambition and the intricate dance of power and belief. So, next time you gaze at the towering Vimanas, remember they're not just aiming for the heavens, they're aiming for history itself. And they hit the mark, leaving us with stories etched in stone, waiting to be retold. As we journey further into the Chola universe of temples that were as much about politics as they were about spirituality, let's pause and appreciate how these stone fortresses became the ultimate power move. We're talking about strategic propaganda on a scale that even modern politicians might envy. You see, in the Chola playbook, temples were like ancient times square billboards, but instead of neon lights and fast food ads, they flaunted divine authority and imperial grandeur. Take, for example, the inscriptions carved meticulously into the walls of these temples. They weren't just decorative doodles. Oh no, these were the ancient press releases, the original tweets etched in stone, proclaiming the Chola rulers as both earthly kings and divine representatives. One famous inscription from the Brihadiswara temple states that Rajaraja Chola I was, the fortunate king of great might, who was beloved of the gods. Talk about a royal flex. In a society where divine favor was the ultimate endorsement, these proclamations were the equivalent of a celestial thumbs up. Now, let's talk economics, because let's face it, every grand gesture needs financial backing. These temples were not just spiritual hubs, they were bustling economic centers. They functioned like ancient Wall Streets, where wealth wasn't just stored but generated. Temples owned vast tracts of land, the revenue of which helped maintain the complex and fund new constructions. Think of it as a divine real estate empire, where the gods had quite the portfolio. But here's where things get really interesting and maybe a bit unsettling. While the temples were symbols of divine favor and imperial benevolence, behind these grand facades was a workforce often overlooked in the romantic retellings. The labor force that built these marvels was as much a part of the temple as the deity inside. Unfortunately, history often writes them off as faceless masses, but these were real people, artists, masons, laborers, whose toil and sweat brought these visions to life. They didn't have the luxury of an 8-hour workday or overtime pay. Their reality was far grittier, involving backbreaking labor under the scorching sun, a reminder that every empire has its unsung heroes. And if you think the Chola temples were just about piety and devotion, hold onto your sacred threads, because they also played a crucial role in quelling dissent and establishing social order. The Chola rulers had a knack for weaving religion into the fabric of governance. Temples were the perfect venues for this, acting as centers of not just spiritual guidance, but also social control. The priests, who presided over these temples, wielded significant influence, acting as intermediaries between the divine and the mortal. They were the original spin doctors, ensuring that the king's image was as immaculate as the idols they worshipped. But let's not forget the political chess game that was the Chola dynasty. These temples were not built in isolation, but were part of a broader strategy to consolidate power. By granting land to Brahmins and other influential groups, the Cholas ensured loyalty and support, which was crucial in maintaining their hold over the region. It was a clever balancing act of carrot and stick, where the carrot was divine favor and the stick was the might of the Chola military. Now, let's bust another myth. the idea of divine rulers. The Cholas were certainly divinely endorsed, but let's not kid ourselves. They were as human as the next dynasty, with ambitions, rivalries, and a penchant for a little elbow grease when it came to expanding their empire. Divine right was a convenient narrative, one that worked wonders in legitimizing their rule. But beneath the veneer of godly anointment was a well-oiled political machine, ready to do what it took to keep the wheels of empire turning. As we dig deeper, it's clear that these architectural marvels were more than just religious edifices. They were the cornerstone of Chola propaganda, economic powerhouses, and political tools. They were designed to awe, inspire, and yes, control. The Cholas understood that to rule over hearts and minds, you needed more than just military might. You needed a narrative, a story that could be told through stone and sculpture, a legacy that would outlast the fleeting nature of human life. And yet, for all their grandeur and political prowess, the Cholas also remind us of the human stories etched into the very fabric of these temples. Behind the divine facades were real people, real lives, and real stories that deserve to be told. While the kings might have their names inscribed in history, it's the collective effort of their people that truly brought their vision to life. As we continue to explore the legacy of the Chola dynasty, let's keep our eyes peeled for the stories that lie beneath the surface. Because history, much like these temples, is layered, complex, and full of surprises. The Cholas may have aimed for the heavens, but it's their earthly endeavors that continue to captivate us, reminding us that behind every grand narrative is a tapestry of ambition, power, and human ingenuity. So while the Chola temples were towering examples of ambition etched in stone, they also doubled as cultural hotspots, the ancient equivalent of Coachella, but with fewer flower crowns and more sacred hymns. Picture a bustling hub of activity where art, music, and dance weren't just pastimes, but vibrant expressions of devotion and community life. These temples were the epicenters of creativity, where the line between the sacred and the secular blurred like a watercolor masterpiece. And let's face it, in a pre-Spotify world, temples were the original concert halls, hosting performances that would make even the most seasoned rock star blush. Now, if you think the Chola temples were all about silent meditation and solemn chants, you'd be missing the point and the party. These were venues where temple dancers, or divadasis, performed intricate Bharatanatyam routines, their anklets jingling in time to live music. This wasn't just a dance. It was a spiritual offering, a form of storytelling that brought ancient myths to life. These performances were more than just entertainment. They were a form of worship, a celebration of the divine in motion. And let's not ignore the fact that these temple performances were a societal glue, pulling communities together in a shared cultural experience. Speaking of storytelling, the temples themselves were like ancient multiplexes. The walls of these grand structures were adorned with carvings that depicted epic tales from Hindu mythology. Imagine walking through a stone comic strip, where each panel is a chapter in an age-old narrative. From the mighty Ramayana to the philosophical depths of the Mahabharata, these sculptures were visual encyclopedias, preserving stories that have been passed down through generations. It's like the original Netflix, providing entertainment, education, and a bit of divine drama, all in one place. And while we're at it, let's talk about the sound of music. The Chola temples weren't just silent stone edifices. They were alive with the sound of instruments like the veena, mridangam, and nadaswaram. Music wasn't just an afterthought. It was woven into the very fabric of temple rituals. The rhythmic beats and melodious tunes were as much a part of the temple atmosphere as the incense and oil lamps. These were not just songs. They were hymns, sonic offerings to the gods, a divine Spotify playlist curated by the priests and musicians of the time. But let's not get too swept away by the romance without acknowledging the grit behind the glam. These cultural activities were a testament to the Cholas' ability to harness art and music as tools of influence. By patronizing the arts, they not only enriched their culture, but also reinforced their divine right to rule. It was a clever strategy, ensuring that the narrative of Chola supremacy was echoed in every note, every dance step, and every story told. A culture of storytelling that ensured their legends endured long after their dynasty had faded into history. Now, let's take a detour into the world of education. These temples were not just about worship and art. They were centers of learning, the ancient Ivy Leagues where knowledge flowed as freely as the sacred Ganges. Think of them as universities with a divine syllabus, where students gathered to study everything from philosophy and mathematics to astronomy and grammar. The temple libraries held a treasure trove of manuscripts, the Wikipedia of their time, offering wisdom and guidance to those who sought it. And while tuition fees weren't a thing back then, the price of admission was a devotion to learning and a reverence for the divine. But here's where it gets interesting. These centers of learning weren't just about rote education. They were arenas for debate and discussion, where ideas were exchanged as freely as a modern-day TED talk. Scholars from across the region would gather to debate philosophical concepts, challenge each other's views, and push the boundaries of knowledge. It was intellectual fencing at its finest, a forum where the sharpest minds could spar and hone their skills. This was the Chola vision of education, a dynamic, interactive process that nurtured not just knowledge but wisdom. Of course, we can't talk about the Cholas without addressing the pop culture phenomenon they've become today. In a world that loves a good historical epic, the Cholas have been romanticized as the rock stars of ancient India. Thanks to larger-than-life portrayals in movies and books, they're often depicted as benevolent rulers with a penchant for grand gestures and divine favor. It's a narrative that's as appealing as it is simplistic, glossing over the complexities and contradictions of their reign. Sure, they built temples that scraped the skies, but they did so with the same strategic cunning that fueled their conquests. Yet, while the romanticized version of the Cholas is fun, it's important to dig deeper and appreciate the genuine cultural contributions they made. Their support of the arts created a legacy that has influenced Indian culture for centuries. The styles of dance, music, and architecture they patronized have endured, evolving over time, but retaining the essence of their origins. It's a testament to the enduring power of culture, a reminder that while empires may rise and fall, the art and stories they leave behind can transcend time. As we continue our journey through the Chola dynasty, it's clear that their temples were more than just places of worship. They were dynamic, multifaceted hubs where the sacred and the secular coexisted, where art and education flourished under the watchful eyes of stone deities. The Cholas understood the power of culture as both a tool and a treasure, a means to solidify their legacy and a gift to future generations. They were architects of not just stone and mortar, but of a cultural heritage that continues to resonate today. So, while the Cholas may be remembered as ancient rock stars, let's not forget the depth behind their dazzling facade. Their temples were symphonies in stone, their stories etched into the very landscape of history. As we leave this chapter open for further exploration, remember that history is not just about the grand gestures. It's about the intricate dance of culture, power, and humanity that leaves a lasting imprint on the world. As we move forward, let's keep uncovering the layers that make this history as enduring and captivating as the temples themselves. And so, as we pivot to the present, we find the Chola temples aren't just relics of a bygone era. They're living, breathing testaments to a legacy that refuses to be silenced by time. These temples stand as cultural beacons, drawing tourists like moths to a flame, eager to bask in their intricate carvings and lofty towers. But let's not romanticize this too much. Tourism is a double-edged sword, bringing both the sweet sound of currency and the sour note of wear and tear. The Brihadiswara temple, for instance, sees thousands of visitors each year, their footsteps echoing through the corridors of history, but also contributing to the physical strain on these ancient structures. Enter the preservationists, the modern-day custodians of these stone giants. Organizations like the Archaeological Survey of India are in a perpetual dance with decay, working tirelessly to ensure that the temples don't crumble under the weight of their own legacy. It's a Herculean task, akin to painting the Golden Gate Bridge. By the time you finish one end, the other needs attention. Restoration projects are as costly as they are necessary, with budgets running into millions of rupees. It's a steep price to pay, but preserving these marvels is a labor of love, ensuring they remain standing for future generations to marvel at and learn from. Now, you might wonder what all this fuss is about. Why go to such lengths to preserve old stones when you could build shiny new ones? Well, that's like asking why we preserve classic literature or ancient traditions. The Chola temples aren't just about bricks and mortar. They're cultural milestones, offering a window into a world where architecture was an art form and temples were the canvas. They tell stories in a language of stone, whispering tales of a civilization that understood the power of legacy. Speaking of legacy, let's talk about influence. The Chola architectural style, with its towering vimanas and intricate sculptures, isn't just a chapter in a history book. It's a blueprint that continues to inspire modern architecture. Look around, and you'll find echoes of Chola designs in contemporary temple architecture across India and beyond. The Dravidian style, marked by its pyramid-shaped towers, is as popular today as it was a millennium ago. It's like the Cholas handed us a baton, and architects across the ages have been running with it ever since. But here's where it gets interesting. The Cholas didn't just influence architecture. They set the stage for a cultural renaissance that continues to ripple through time. Their temples were not only architectural wonders, but also cultural epicenters that fostered art, music, and dance. Fast forward to today, and you'll see how these art forms have evolved, yet remain deeply rooted in their Chola origins. Bharatanatyam, the classical dance form that graced the temple halls centuries ago, is now a celebrated art form worldwide, with performances that captivate audiences from Chennai to Chicago. Yet, let's not get too swept up in the romance without acknowledging the grit beneath the glamour. The Chola dynasty, like any other empire, was a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, power, and politics. Their temples, while awe-inspiring, were also instruments of control, symbols of a political narrative that justified their rule. It's a classic tale of power cloaked in piety, where divine endorsement was as much a political strategy as it was a spiritual endeavor. And as we stand at the crossroads of history and modernity, we're reminded that the Cholas left us more than just architectural marvels. They left a legacy that challenges us to see history in its full spectrum. Romantic yet raw, grand yet grounded in reality. It's a legacy that invites us to explore the intricate dance between past and present, urging us to appreciate the beauty of these stone giants while acknowledging the human stories etched in their shadows. So, the next time you find yourself wandering through the corridors of a Chola temple, take a moment to pause. Let your fingers trace the carvings that have withstood the test of time. Listen to the echoes of ancient hymns in the breeze, and imagine the lives intertwined with these stones. Because in the end, the Cholas remind us that history isn't just a series of events. It's a living, breathing narrative that continues to shape our world in ways both seen and unseen. As we wrap up this journey through the Chola dynasty's architectural legacy, let's remember that history is a mirror, reflecting the complexities of human nature. The Cholas, with their grand ambitions and intricate designs, were architects of not just buildings, but of a cultural heritage that remains as vibrant today as it was 1,000 years ago. Their temples stand not just as monuments to a bygone era, but as reminders that the dance of history is as much about the stories we tell as it is about the stones we leave behind. Corsica, 1769. Picture it, an island that's essentially the Mediterranean's version of the Wild West, but with more goats and fewer gunfights. Here, amidst the rugged landscapes and volatile politics, a boy named Napoleon Bonaparte is born. Now, if you've heard the tales, you'd think he popped out of the womb with a tiny tricorn hat and a fully formed battle plan. The truth, not quite. He was born into a family of minor nobility, which sounds fancy, but in Corsica, it really just meant they had slightly less goat poop in their yard than the neighbors. Napoleon was the second of 8 surviving siblings, which meant he spent a lot of time dodging elbows and fighting for the last slice of cheese. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer and something of a social climber, always angling for better connections. His mother, Letizia, was the real powerhouse. Raising those 8 kids was no small feat, and she did it with a mix of iron discipline and practical wisdom. So, if Napoleon developed a knack for strategy, you could say he learned it at the family dinner table. Now, about that height thing. Napoleon wasn't the shortest ruler ever, but he wasn't exactly towering either. At about 5'6", he was perfectly average for the time, which makes the whole Napoleon complex thing a bit of historical trolling by the British. They loved to mark him as a shorty, probably because they couldn't handle the fact that he kept beating them on the battlefield. As a boy, Napoleon was sent off to mainland France for schooling, a journey that would shape his destiny. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Imagine this. Young Napoleon, a Corsican islander with a thick accent, plopped into a French military academy at the tender age of 9. He must have felt like a fish out of water, or maybe a goat out of the pasture. Napoleon's education was sponsored by the French government, thanks to his father's canny politicking. Yes, Carlo managed to get his son a scholarship, essentially turning Napoleon into the 18th century equivalent of a foreign exchange student. And like many exchange students, he faced his share of teasing and isolation. He was known to be a loner, more comfortable with books and maps than with his classmates. At the military academy in Brienne-la-Château, young Bonaparte honed his interests in history and geography, sharpening those skills that would later serve him well in military strategy. But he also showed a penchant for stubbornness and a fiery temper. Not exactly the makings of a diplomat, but then again, diplomacy was never his strong suit. Napoleon's time at Brienne was tough. He dealt with prejudice from the French students who saw Corsicans as rustic outsiders. But instead of letting it crush him, Napoleon used it as fuel. He devoured books on military tactics and history, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. By 1784, he was off to the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, where he completed 2 years of training in just one, a testament to his brilliance or perhaps his impatience, depending on who you ask. At 16, he became a second lieutenant in the artillery. Now, this was a guy who knew his way around a cannon. Technical precision of artillery work appealed to Napoleon's methodical mind. Plus, it was a field where he could prove himself through sheer skill, not just noble connections. It was a perfect fit for an ambitious young man with something to prove. While Napoleon was busy firing cannons and scribbling battle plans, Corsica was in turmoil. The island, long a pawn in the power struggles between France and Genoa, was finally annexed by France in 1768, a year before Napoleon's birth. Not everyone was thrilled about this, least of all the Corsican nationalists. Napoleon's own father had initially supported Corsican independence, but eventually switched allegiances, a decision that no doubt influenced young Napoleon's pragmatic approach to politics. Corsican politics was a labyrinth of alliances and betrayals, where yesterday's enemy could be today's ally. It was a place where loyalty was fluid, and survival often depended on which way the political wind was blowing. Growing up in such an environment, Napoleon learned the importance of adaptability, a skill that would serve him well as he navigated the treacherous waters of European power dynamics. So, there you have it, a young Napoleon navigating the shift from Corsican islander to French military cadet. It's a story of ambition, adaptation, and a bit of luck. And while the myth of the short, power-hungry tyrant might make for good theatre, the reality is far more complex. This was a young man who turned adversity into opportunity, who saw a world beyond his island home and reached for it with both hands. As we close this chapter, remember, the seeds of greatness are often sown in the most unlikely of places. Who would have thought that a boy from an island, better known for its goats than its emperors, would one day change the course of history? Napoleon's early years were just the beginning of a saga that would see him rise to the pinnacle of power, only to fall just as spectacularly. But that's a story for another night. For now, let's leave young Napoleon to his dreams of glory as we drift off into our own. Napoleon was dreaming big, sure, but his journey to glory wasn't all cannons and roses. Let's jump forward to 1793, the Siege of Toulon, where young Bonaparte got his first real taste of military command. Picture this. France is in chaos, the revolution is in full swing, and a coalition of European powers is circling like vultures over a carcass. Toulon, a strategic Mediterranean port, had fallen into the hands of royalists and their British pals. Enter Napoleon, a 24-year-old artillery captain with ideas as big as his ego. Now, Toulon wasn't just any port. It was a linchpin in France's naval strategy. Whoever controlled Toulon controlled the Mediterranean. The stakes were high, and failure was not an option. Napoleon, always the man with a plan, quickly assessed the situation. He proposed capturing the heights overlooking the harbor, because, let's face it, whoever controls the high ground usually wins. His superiors, initially skeptical, eventually gave in, and boy, did Napoleon deliver. With precise artillery placements and relentless assaults, he forced the British to evacuate in December 1793. Toulon was retaken, and Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general. Just like that, a star was born. But let's not get too swept up in the romance of it all. Yes, Napoleon was a tactical genius, but he was also a man who knew how to seize an opportunity and make it work for him. He understood the power of narrative, how victories could be spun into legends, turning a mere mortal into a national hero. His letters and reports from Toulon were as much about self-promotion as they were about military strategy. The myth of Napoleon was already taking shape, and he was its chief architect. After Toulon, Napoleon's career rocketed. By 1796, he was given command of the French army of Italy. Now, the Italian campaign is where Napoleon really dazzled Europe. At just 26, he was leading an underfed, underpaid, and under-equipped army against the Austrians and their allies. The odds were about as favorable as a snowball's chance in hell. But Napoleon saw potential where others saw defeat. He transformed his ragtag battalion into a fierce fighting force, using speed, deception, and surprise to outmaneuver the enemy. Take the Battle of Lodi, for example. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a psychological triumph. Napoleon crossed a bridge under heavy fire, inspiring his troops to follow. The Austrians, bewildered by the audacity, retreated. This wasn't just about winning battles. It was about instilling belief in his soldiers and fear in his enemies. Napoleon's Italian campaign was a masterclass in strategic brilliance, turning him into a living legend. Yet, while he was conquering Italy, Napoleon was also busy on another front, his love life. Enter Josephine de Beauharnais, a widow 6 years his senior, who captivated him like no other. Their relationship was a roller coaster of passion and betrayal. Napoleon was head over heels, writing her letters filled with both affection and jealousy, sometimes more soap opera than love story. But Josephine was no wide-eyed romantic. She was savvy, using her charm and connections to navigate the treacherous waters of post-revolutionary France. Josephine's influence on Napoleon was profound. He was smitten, but also suspicious, aware of her affairs and flirtations. Yet she was his muse, his confidante, and ultimately his wife. Their marriage in 1796 was as much a strategic alliance as a romantic union. Josephine brought social standing and connections that Napoleon, the ambitious Corsican, found invaluable. She was the yin to his yang, the calm to his storm, a storm that was now sweeping across Europe. By the time the Italian campaign wrapped up in 1797, Napoleon was a national hero. He had negotiated the Treaty of Campo Formio, redrawing the map of Europe and showcasing his diplomatic prowess. The treaty allowed France to annex the Austrian Netherlands and parts of Italy, while Napoleon pocketed a nice chunk of change in the form of looted art and treasures. Not too shabby for a guy who started with nothing more than a cannon and a dream. But success came with its own set of challenges. Napoleon was becoming too powerful, too popular for some tastes in Paris. The political winds were shifting, and not everyone was thrilled with his meteoric rise. Some saw him as a threat to the Republic, a potential tyrant in the making, and they weren't entirely wrong. Napoleon, for all his brilliance, was a man who craved power and control. He was acutely aware of how quickly fortunes could change in revolutionary France, where yesterday's hero could be tomorrow's scapegoat. Yet, for now, Napoleon was on top of the world. He had the support of his army, the adoration of the people, and the begrudging respect of his political rivals. But as we know, the higher you climb, the harder you fall. Napoleon's story was far from over, and the path ahead was a treacherous one. But that, my friends, is a tale for another time. For now, let's revel in the rise of a man who dared to dream big and shake the world to its core. And so, Napoleon was riding high on a wave of military victories, basking in the glory of a well-played Italian campaign. But while he was busy conquering European hearts and minds, Paris was a cauldron of revolutionary fervor, political intrigue, and frankly, a whole lot of backstabbing. In this volatile landscape, Napoleon saw opportunity, a chance to pivot from the soldier's life to something grander, something more, well, imperial. The late 1790s in France were like a season finale of House of Cards on steroids. The French Revolution had turned the political scene into a game of musical chairs, where the music was a guillotine blade swishing through the air. The Directory, the 5-member committee that governed France, was as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. Corruption was rampant, the economy was tanking, and the people were restless. It was a perfect breeding ground for someone with ambition, a knack for strategy, and a disregard for the existing political order. Enter Napoleon Bonaparte. By 1799, Napoleon was back from his less-than-stellar Egyptian campaign, where his grand plans of empire building had been thwarted by pesky British naval commander Horatio Nelson, and a bout of the bubonic plague. Talk about a bad vacation. Yet, despite the debacle, Napoleon returned to France with his reputation mostly intact, thanks in no small part to some skillful media manipulation. In an era long before Instagram filters, Napoleon mastered the art of the PR spin, ensuring that his image remained that of a hero, not a hapless adventurer. Back in France, Napoleon quickly became the poster boy for change, the dashing general who could save the Republic from its own incompetence. His timing was impeccable. The political climate was ripe for a coup, and Napoleon was just the man to execute it, literally and figuratively. On November 9, 1799, he pulled off the coup of 18 Brumaire, a masterstroke of political maneuvering that dismantled the Directory and installed him as first consul. It was a classic out with the old, in with the new scenario, except the new was more of the same under a different name. Napoleon's ascent to power was as much about optics as it was about strategy. He understood that people craved stability, and he presented himself as the antidote to chaos. The coup was swift, almost bloodless, and brilliantly executed. It was the kind of power play that would make Machiavelli nod in approval. Overnight, Napoleon transformed from a military hero to the political savior of France, with the kind of power that made the current politicians look like mere puppets. Once in power, Napoleon wasted no time in reshaping France. His most enduring legacy, the Napoleonic Code, was a legal overhaul that would become the bedrock of modern civil law. Now, let's not get carried away with romantic notions of justice and equality. The code was revolutionary, sure, but it was also a tool for consolidating power. It emphasized state control and uniformity, ensuring that the legal system served Napoleon's centralist vision. Women, for example, weren't exactly popping champagne over their newfound rights. They were still very much second-class citizens. So while the Napoleonic Code was a leap forward, it was more of a hop, skip, and a jump back for gender equality. As first consul, Napoleon was the puppet master, pulling strings with the dexterity of a seasoned politician. He centralized power, streamlined the bureaucracy, and beefed up the military. His governance style was a mix of authoritative efficiency and theatrical flair. Napoleon was a man who loved his titles, and boy, did he have a lot of them. By 1802, he was first consul for life, a title that screamed, "I'm not going anywhere," louder than a rooster at dawn. But why stop at consul when you can be an emperor? In 1804, Napoleon decided that being a mere mortal ruler wasn't enough. He crowned himself Emperor of the French in a ceremony that was part coronation, part spectacle, and all about Napoleon. The grandeur of the event was eclipsed only by the audacity of the act. Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head, a symbolic gesture that said, "Thanks, Your Holiness, but I got this." The coronation was a masterclass in self-promotion. It was held in Notre Dame Cathedral, with all the pomp and ceremony of a royal event, because if you're going to anoint yourself emperor, you might as well do it in style. The guest list was a who's who of European royalty, dignitaries, and of course, Josephine, now empress, who wore a gown that probably cost more than a small country's GDP. Napoleon's rise to emperor might sound like a fairy tale, but it was more like an artfully crafted narrative. He understood the power of image, the allure of grandeur, and the importance of legacy. His reign was built on the dual pillars of military might and political cunning, with a dash of theatricality for good measure. As emperor, Napoleon set about transforming France into his vision of a modern state. He established the Bank of France to stabilize the economy, reformed the educational system, and built roads and canals to boost trade. But let's not sugarcoat it. His governance style was as centralized and controlling as a helicopter parent. He had an eye for detail and a penchant for micromanagement, making sure every aspect of French life was aligned with his grand design. While Napoleon's domestic policies were reshaping France, his foreign ambitions were redrawing the map of Europe. He was a man who didn't just want to rule France. He wanted to rule the world. His military campaigns expanded the French Empire, creating a web of alliances and satellite states that extended his influence far beyond France's borders. But with great power comes great resistance, and not everyone was on board with Napoleon's imperial aspirations. The British, in particular, were less than thrilled with Napoleon's rise. They saw him as a threat to the balance of power in Europe and were determined to stop his continental ambitions. Napoleon's response was the continental system, an economic blockade aimed at crippling Britain's trade. It was a bold move, but one that ultimately backfired, damaging European economies more than Britain's. Yet, for all his flaws, Napoleon was a leader who understood the power of narrative. He crafted a legacy that, despite its complexities, continues to captivate the world. His rise from a Corsican outsider to the Emperor of the French is a testament to ambition, strategy, and a bit of luck. But as we know, the higher the climb, the greater the fall. Napoleon's journey was far from over, and the road ahead was fraught with challenges. As emperor, he was now a man with enemies at every turn, both at home and abroad. The European powers were gearing up for a fight, and the stakes were higher than ever. But that, my friends, is a story for another day. For now, let's leave Napoleon basking in the glow of his imperial triumph, as the shadow of his next great challenge looms on the horizon. While Napoleon was basking in the glow of his imperial triumph, the shadow of his next great challenge loomed ominously on the horizon. The zenith of his empire wasn't just a high point. It was the calm before the storm, a moment of deceptive stability before everything would soon unravel like a poorly knitted scarf. Let's start with Austerlitz, December 2, 1805, perhaps the crown jewel in Napoleon's military diadem. Also known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, because why settle for one when you can have a trio? You had Napoleon himself, Russian Tsar Alexander I, and Holy Roman Emperor Francis Roman II. On paper, it looked like a lopsided match, 68,000 French soldiers against a combined force of 85,000 Russians and Austrians. But what Austerlitz teaches us is that Napoleon didn't just play the numbers game, he played the humans game. He had a knack for reading his opponents and predicting their moves like a chess grandmaster on caffeine. Napoleon's tactical genius shone that foggy December morning. He deliberately weakened his right flank, luring the Allies into a false sense of security. They bit hard as their forces surged forward. Napoleon drove his own troops straight into the exposed Allied center, like a steel spike through a marshmallow. The result, a resounding French victory, with the Allies losing nearly 36,000 men compared to France's 9,000. It was a slaughter, but one that cemented Napoleon's reputation as a military genius. What's a little carnage when the history books will label you a legend, right? But while Austerlitz was a high point, the Peninsular War was a thorn in Napoleon's side that just wouldn't quit. Spain, 1808, a place where Napoleon's dreams of empire hit the rocky shores of guerrilla warfare. The Peninsular War was the Spanish ulcer, a protracted and bloody conflict that bled French resources dry. Here, Napoleon's image as a liberator clashed spectacularly with the brutal realities of occupation. The French started with an easy victory, occupying Madrid with the ease of a tourist getting lost in the city's winding streets. But that was just the beginning. The Spanish, with a little help from the British under Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, turned guerrilla warfare into an art form. They harried French forces, disrupted supply lines, and made life miserable for Napoleon's soldiers. The cost was enormous, both in terms of lives and the strain on the French economy. By the end of the conflict, France had lost around 300,000 men. Napoleon, it seems, had underestimated the tenacity of the Spanish, who weren't too keen on swapping one overlord for another. And then there's the continental system. Napoleon's grand economic blockade meant to bring Britain to its knees by cutting off its trade with Europe. It was economic warfare at its finest, or perhaps its most delusional. Sure, in theory, it made sense. Deprive Britain of its trade lifeline and watch the empire crumble. In practice, however, it was like trying to dry out the Atlantic with a hairdryer. Britain, ever the resourceful trader, found new markets in the Americas and Asia. Meanwhile, Europe suffered. Smuggling flourished, and the economies of the continent took a nosedive, like a financial Titanic, without the romantic subplots. The continental system was meant to be a stranglehold, but it ended up being more of a nuisance. It hurt France and its allies more than Britain, and dissent began to fester in occupied territories. Ironically, the system that was supposed to bind Europe under French control instead sowed seeds of resentment and rebellion. Talk about a plan backfiring. But even as these seeds of dissent sprouted, Napoleon's ambition knew no bounds. By 1812, it was time for the Piece de Résistance, the campaign that would become the stuff of military myths and cautionary tales alike, the invasion of Russia. Now, if you've ever wondered what hubris looks like, picture Napoleon standing at the head of a grand armée of over 600,000 men, the largest force Europe had ever seen, marching towards Moscow. It was an audacious plan, bold even by Napoleon's standards, but as every gambler knows, a big bet can mean a big loss. The Russian campaign started with promise. Napoleon advanced into the vast expanse of Russia, capturing Smolensk and winning a costly victory at Borodino. But the Russians, led by Tsar Alexander I, had a trick up their fur-lined sleeves, scorched earth. They retreated, burning everything in their wake, leaving nothing for the French to scavenge. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow, he found it abandoned and ablaze, torched by its own citizens. The capture of Moscow was supposed to be the crowning achievement, but instead, Napoleon was left with a hollow victory, a city in ashes, and a supply line stretched thinner than a Parisian crepe. Winter came early that year, and Mother Nature proved to be Napoleon's most formidable adversary. The Russian winter was merciless, and the retreat from Moscow was a nightmare of cold, starvation, and Cossack raids. Of the 600,000 men who had marched in, fewer than 100,000 limped back. It was a catastrophic loss, not just in manpower but in prestige. The invincible emperor had been humbled by the elements, his grand armée reduced to a shadow of its former self. The myth of Napoleon, the liberator, was unraveling, tangled up in the harsh reality of war and occupation. His empire, once sprawling and magnificent, was now overstretched and vulnerable. The economic strain from endless campaigns and the continental system's failure was catching up. Napoleon, the master tactician, had overplayed his hand, and the consequences were coming home to roost. Yet, for all his failings, Napoleon's story was far from concluded. The emperor who had once seemed larger than life was now facing challenges that even his formidable will might not overcome. But as history would show, Napoleon was nothing if not resilient. The stage was set for a dramatic act of redemption, or perhaps a final fall from grace. But that, dear reader, is a story for another day. For now, let's leave Napoleon in the shadows of his Russian debacle as the winds of change begin to howl across Europe, signaling the end of an era and the beginning of another. So, with Napoleon licking his wounds from the Russian debacle, you'd think he'd take a moment to regroup, maybe sip some vin rouge and rethink his life choices. But no, Napoleon was nothing if not tenacious. Like a gambler on a losing streak, he doubled down, determined to roll the dice one more time. Enter the Battle of Leipzig, 1813, also known as the Battle of Nations, because why have one enemy when you can have them all? This was the largest battle in Europe prior to World War I, with over 600,000 troops from multiple nations clashing. It was like a chaotic family reunion, but with cannons and bayonets. Napoleon found himself facing the Sixth Coalition, a veritable who's who of European powerhouses. Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden, all eager to knock the French emperor off his perch. The battle raged over 4 days, from October 16 to 19, and it was a logistical nightmare. Napoleon, ever the strategist, was outnumbered with only about 200,000 men at his disposal. His forces were stretched thinner than a Parisian croissant, and his supply lines were as tangled as a plate of spaghetti. Despite his brilliance on the battlefield, Napoleon couldn't overcome the sheer weight of numbers and the coordinated effort of the Allies. The French were outflanked and outgunned, and after intense fighting, they were forced to retreat. It was a crushing blow. French casualties estimated at 38,000 and Allied losses even higher at around 54,000. Leipzig was a turning point, the start of the end for Napoleon's empire. The myth of invincibility was shattered, and the vultures of Europe began circling, ready to carve up the spoils. Defeated but not destroyed, Napoleon retreated to France, where the walls were closing in. The Allies were advancing, and Paris was rife with discontent. By April 1814, with his marshals pressuring him and the political situation untenable, Napoleon did the unthinkable. He abdicated the throne. And so, the once mighty emperor found himself exiled to the tiny island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. Talk about a dramatic change of scenery, from the grandeur of the Tuileries Palace to a Mediterranean rock with more goats than people. But if you thought Napoleon would while away his days sipping limoncello and contemplating his failures, you clearly don't know our man. Elba became his new project, his miniature empire. He reformed the island's government, improved agriculture, and even designed a flag. It was as if he couldn't help but try to conquer even this small domain. Yet, the lure of power and the call of destiny were too strong to ignore. Less than a year later, in March 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba in a daring, almost theatrical, return to France. What followed was the 100 Days, a whirlwind comeback tour that saw Napoleon rallying the French people with promises of glory and reform. He gathered an army and marched on Paris, reinstating himself as emperor with the kind of audacity that would make a reality TV star blush. Europe, in response, wasn't having any of it. The Allies regrouped, determined to put an end to Napoleon's ambitions once and for all. Which brings us to the muddy fields of Waterloo, June 18, 1815. Here, Napoleon faced off against the Duke of Wellington's British-led coalition and the Prussians under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. The stakes were sky-high, and Napoleon gambled everything on a single decisive battle. The fighting was brutal, with around 140,000 troops engaged. Despite initial successes, the tide turned against Napoleon as the Prussian forces arrived to reinforce the British. By the end of the day, the French were in disarray. Napoleon's once vaunted tactical genius couldn't save him from the combined might of his enemies. The Battle of Waterloo resulted in approximately 25,000 French casualties and marked the final collapse of Napoleon's bid for power. His reign was over, his empire dismantled. Captured and exiled once more, this time Napoleon was sent to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, a place as bleak and isolated as his political prospects. On St. Helena, Napoleon spent his remaining years under British guard, cut off from the world he'd once sought to dominate. He dictated his memoirs, spun tales of his glory days, and carefully curated his legacy. Even in exile, he was acutely aware of history's gaze, determined to shape how he would be remembered. It was a lonely existence, punctuated by bouts of illness and introspection. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once held Europe in his grip, died at the age of 51. The cause? Likely stomach cancer, though rumors of poison lingered, as they tend to do when legends die under mysterious circumstances. So, what do we make of Napoleon's extraordinary life? He was a man who rose from obscurity to reshape Europe, a military genius with a penchant for bold gambles and grandiose ambitions. His reforms left an indelible mark on French society, and his campaigns changed the face of warfare. Yet, for all his brilliance, he was also a cautionary tale, a reminder of the perils of unchecked ambition and the fickle nature of power. The myths surrounding Napoleon endure because they capture the imagination, the rise of a self-made man, the audacity of an emperor, the tragedy of a fallen hero. History loves a good story, and Napoleon's life was nothing if not a dramatic narrative. But peel back the layers of myth, and what remains is a complex figure, a man of contradictions, driven by both vision and vanity. In the end, perhaps Napoleon's greatest legacy is his reminder that history is shaped by those who dare to dream big, who take risks and defy conventions. He was a master of reinvention, adapting to the tides of fortune even as they turned against him. And while his empire crumbled, his legend only grew, a testament to the enduring allure of power and the human fascination with those who wield it. So, as you drift off to sleep, ponder this. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican outsider who became the emperor of the French, may have lost his throne, but he won something far more elusive, the eternal intrigue of history. And in the grand scheme of things, perhaps that's the greatest victory of all. The year is 1347, and Europe is about to get a makeover it definitely didn't ask for. It's the kind of makeover where the stylist is a microscopic bacterium named Yersinia pestis, who didn't get the memo that less is more. This little pest had a knack for accessorizing with death, and it was about to give the continent a new look that involved a whole lot of black and not much living. The tale kicks off in the bustling ports of the Black Sea, where Genos traders were about to bring back more than just exotic spices and silks. These traders were unwittingly playing a game of biological tag, and spoiler alert, everyone was it. Their ships carried a deadly cargo in the form of rats, and those rats hosted fleas, and those fleas were the ultimate delivery service for Yersinia pestis. Think of it as the medieval Uber Eats, but instead of pizza, you're getting plague. And like all great delivery services, it was fast, spreading across Europe with the speed of a viral TikTok dance challenge. Now, let's talk about those rats. These were not your cute, animated, cheese-loving rodents. Oh no, these were the aggressive, disease-riddled kind that you wouldn't want in your kitchen, let alone your continent. But rats were only part of the problem. The real villains of this story were the fleas hitching a ride on these furry carriers. Once the fleas bit into a human, the bacterium Yersinia pestis was free to wreak havoc, and it did so with ruthless efficiency. Yersinia pestis didn't waste time. Within days of infection, victims experienced fever, chills, vomiting, and excruciating buboes. Those infamous swollen lymph nodes that made you look like you were auditioning for a horror movie. Mortality rates were staggering, with estimates suggesting that anywhere between 30–60% of Europe's population was wiped out. In some cities, the death toll reached as high as 80%, making it the medieval equivalent of a dystopian film with an all-too-real script. And let's not gloss over the timeline here. This was no flash-in-the-pan event. The Black Death ravaged Europe for nearly 4 years, from 1347 to 1351, leaving a trail of devastation that will be hard to comprehend even today. The population of Europe was around 80 million before the plague hit, and by the time it had run its course, it had decreased by about 25 million. That's a loss of nearly a third of the entire continent's people, a statistic that would make even the most stoic medieval chronicler reach for a stiff drink. But why did this happen? Why did Europe, in particular, become a prime target for Yersinia pestis? Well, let's just say that the 14th century wasn't exactly winning any awards for hygiene. The streets were lined with refuse and waste, and people believed that bathing opened the pores to disease. It was like a bacteria's paradise, with no hand sanitizers or antiseptic wipes in sight. Urban centers were particularly hard hit, as cramped living conditions and poor sanitation made them the perfect breeding grounds for both rats and disease. Now, it's easy to romanticize the medieval period with images of gallant knights and grand castles, but the reality was far less glamorous. The Black Death exposed the cracks in this romantic facade, revealing a world where survival was a daily struggle and death was an all-too-frequent visitor. The pandemic didn't discriminate, though it was particularly harsh on the poor, who had fewer resources and less ability to flee the infected areas. Despite the catastrophic impact, the Black Death also brought about significant changes. It was a grim equalizer, breaking down social hierarchies as both nobles and peasants succumbed to the disease. The labor shortages that followed meant that surviving workers could demand higher wages and better working conditions, leading to the gradual erosion of the feudal system. In a twisted way, Yersinia pestis set the stage for the modern world, though at a terrible cost. So, there you have it. The Black Death was a plague that didn't just reshape Europe. It tore through it like a wrecking ball, leaving nothing untouched. It was a brutal reminder of humanity's vulnerability and the dark side of interconnected trade routes. But it was also a catalyst for change, proving that even out of the darkest times, new beginnings can emerge. The continent would rebuild, but it would never quite be the same again. As the dust settled, and Europe began to pick up the pieces, it was clear that the Black Death had done more than just decimate the population. It had fundamentally altered the social and economic landscape. Picture this, a world where workers were in such short supply that they suddenly found themselves in a power position they never dreamed of. It was like an entire continent had hit the labor market lottery, and everyone was cashing in their winning ticket. Before the plague, Europe was a classic case of feudalism 101, with peasants tied to the land, working under lords who held all the cards. But when the plague wiped out up to 60% of the population, the labor force was gutted. Suddenly, there were more fields than farmers, more tasks than taskmasters. The survivors found themselves with a rare and unexpected advantage. They could demand higher wages and better working conditions. It was like the universe had hit the reset button on the feudal system, and peasants weren't about to squander the opportunity. Landowners, both noble and wealthy, were forced to compete for labor. They offered not just better pay, but also perks to entice workers. Think of it as the medieval version of a competitive benefits package. In some areas, wages doubled, and workers began to have a say in their employment terms. It was revolutionary, and it shook the foundations of feudal society. The old system, where lords wielded absolute power, was cracking, and the workers were pushing their way through. This newfound economic leverage wasn't just about better paychecks. It also allowed for social mobility, something that was about as rare as a unicorn sighting before the plague. Peasants could move to different towns, seeking the best offers, and in doing so, they slowly eroded the rigid class distinctions that had defined Europe for centuries. It was a slow burn, but the seeds of change had been sown. And then there were the women. Oh, yes, the women. The Black Death didn't discriminate, and with men dying in droves, women stepped up to fill roles that had been traditionally male-dominated. They worked in trades, managed businesses, and even took on leadership roles within guilds. It was an unexpected boost to women's rights, and while it wasn't exactly a full-blown feminist revolution, it was a step in the right direction. Women proved they were more than capable, and this shift would have long-lasting effects on gender roles in Europe. But let's not get too carried away with the positive changes. The plague was a grim reaper, and its influence wasn't always so constructive. Enter the flagellants, a group of individuals who decided that the best way to appease a wrathful deity was through self-punishment. These folks were like the original Goths, clad in dark robes, marching from town to town, whipping themselves in public displays of penance. It was a bizarre and macabre spectacle, but in a world where answers were scarce, such extremes seemed reasonable. The flagellants believed that the plague was a punishment from God, and to stop it, they had to demonstrate their remorse physically. Their processions drew large crowds, and for a time they were seen as holy figures, offering divine intervention. However, their movement was eventually condemned by the Church, which saw them as a threat to its authority. The flagellants faded into obscurity, but their existence highlighted the desperation and fear that permeated Europe during these dark times. Despite this, there was a strange silver lining to the chaos. The depopulation caused by the plague resulted in an abundance of land and resources. With fewer mouths to feed, there was more food to go around, and agricultural practices slowly improved. Farmers could afford to rotate crops and let fields lie fallow, which increased yields and improved the diet of the average person. It was an ironic twist, but the plague inadvertently set the stage for a more prosperous future. Art and culture also underwent a transformation. The pervasive sense of mortality inspired artists and writers to explore themes of death and the afterlife. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a popular motif, depicting the universality of death in a way that resonated with the survivors. It was art imitating life, or perhaps death, and it left a lasting impression on European culture. So there you have it, a world turned upside down, reshaped by a microscopic foe. The Black Death wasn't just a biological disaster, it was a catalyst for change. Society was forced to adapt, and while the path was fraught with hardship, it was also paved with new opportunities. The aftermath of the plague was a testament to human resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's room for growth and transformation. But don't think we're done yet. The story of the Black Death is far from over. The plague's impact would ripple through history, influencing everything from religion to economics. So stay tuned, because this is just the beginning of a much larger narrative, where the past continues to echo into the future. The Black Death's tangled web spun far beyond biology. It wove itself into the very fabric of medieval Europe's political and social tapestry. As if a pandemic wasn't enough, leaders of the time decided they needed to add a sprinkle of chaos with a side of scapegoating. In their defense, when you're losing up to 60% of your population, rationality tends to take a holiday. So, who caught the blame? Witches, foreigners, and anyone else who looked like they might have a secret recipe for despair. Let's kick off with the witches, those perennial scapegoats of medieval calamities. When the going got tough, townsfolk got torch-happy. Women accused of witchcraft became the unwitting stars of a very grim reality show, one where the stakes were literally life and death. The logic, or whatever passed for it, was that witches had made a pact with the devil, unleashing the plague as a supernatural punishment. It was a convenient, albeit completely unfounded, explanation. Never mind that these women often had nothing more magical than herbal remedies to their names. Foreigners, too, found themselves unwelcome guests at this grim party. The perennial blame the outsider tactic reared its head, with Jewish communities bearing the brunt of this xenophobia. In one particularly dark chapter, the city of Strasbourg saw 900 Jews burned alive in 1349. It was a horrific act of violence, born out of fear and ignorance. The irony: these communities were often more sanitary than their accusers, practicing hygiene rituals that likely made them less susceptible to the plague. But who needs facts when you've got a convenient scapegoat, right? And let's not forget the absurdity of medieval science, or lack thereof. Physicians of the time, bless their optimistic hearts, prescribed everything from bloodletting to concoctions of ground unicorn horn spoiler. Not a real thing to combat the plague. It was a medical free-for-all, where the cure was often as deadly as the disease. This was an era where you might as well have consulted your local blacksmith as your doctor, given the efficacy of the treatments on offer. Now, onto the political elites, those supposed bastions of leadership. In a crisis that demanded decisive action, many rulers were more concerned with protecting their own wealth and power than the lives of their subjects. Take Edward Roman III of England, who, rather than focusing on the plague ravaging his kingdom, decided to wage war in France. His logic was presumably along the lines of, if you're going to be miserable, might as well be miserable with a bigger empire. Then there's Philip VI of France, who, in an impressive feat of political gymnastics, managed to blame the plague on the English, as if the disease was some sort of medieval biological warfare. It's a classic case of deflect and distract, an age-old political strategy that's been practiced to perfection over the centuries. Meanwhile, the romanticized knights of medieval lore were busy showing their true colors. Forget the chivalric code. When the plague rolled into town, many knights were more concerned with saving their own skins than defending the helpless. The reality was that chivalry often took a backseat to survival instincts. And let's be real, it's hard to maintain a sense of noble duty when you're dodging death every day. The pandemic revealed that the much-lauded knightly code was more of a suggestion than a rule, with self-preservation often trumping valor. The Black Death didn't just expose the fault lines in leadership and military honor. It also highlighted the fragility of church authority. With God seemingly silent on the matter, people began to question the clergy's ability to intercede on their behalf. The plague was an equal opportunity destroyer, and clergymen were just as vulnerable as their flocks. The clergy's inability to provide answers or remedy the situation led to a crisis of faith. After all, when your local priest is just as likely to be part of the funeral procession as the service, it raises some uncomfortable spiritual questions. Yet, amidst this turmoil, some leaders did rise to the occasion. Take Alfonso Roman XI of Castile, who, rather than fleeing, stayed to govern his people, until the plague claimed him in 1350. His actions were a rare example of leadership in a time when most rulers were more interested in self-preservation than public service. Alfonso's commitment to his realm, even in the face of death, was a stark contrast to many of his contemporaries. As the plague continued its deadly march across Europe, it left in its wake not just bodies, but a profound sense of disillusionment. The societal structures that had seemed so solid were crumbling, and the institutions that had claimed to provide stability and guidance were floundering. But in the chaos, there was also an opportunity, a chance to rethink and rebuild. The political aftermath of the Black Death was as complex as a medieval tapestry, with threads of fear, blame, and opportunism woven throughout, but it was also a period of unexpected resilience and adaptation. The survivors, those who had witnessed the world turned upside down, emerged with a new perspective. And while the road to recovery was long and fraught with challenges, the seeds of change had been planted. So, as we continue to unravel this historical saga, remember that the story of the Black Death is not just a tale of loss. It's also a narrative of transformation. The choices made during this period, both good and bad, would echo through the centuries, shaping the world in ways those medieval Europeans could scarcely have imagined. Stay tuned, because the echoes of the past have a funny way of resonating far into the future. As the dust of the Black Death began to settle, the grim reality of Europe's new normal unfolded, and with it came a cultural renaissance of sorts, albeit one draped in black. Imagine a world where death had moved in as an unwelcome roommate, refusing to pay rent and constantly reminding everyone of their mortality. It's little wonder that art, literature, and humor took a turn towards the macabre, as people sought to make sense of the chaos that had appended their lives. Enter the dance macabre, or dance of death, a visual and literary motif that captured the morbid zeitgeist of post-plague Europe. This wasn't your typical waltz or courtly dance. It was a grim conga line of skeletons, leading everyone from kings to peasants in a somber reminder that death is the ultimate equalizer. Artists across Europe, from Germany's Hans Holbein to France's Guy Marchand, embraced this theme, illustrating that no matter your social status, everyone was eventually going to the same after-party. But why this fixation on death in art and culture? Well, when roughly a third of the population has been wiped out, mortality isn't just a philosophical concept, it's practically a daily event. The dance macabre captured the pervasive sense of uncertainty and inevitability that lingered in the air like an unwelcome odor. It served as both a coping mechanism and a form of social commentary, a way for people to confront their fears in a time when existential dread was as common as bread and ale. Speaking of existential dread, let's not forget about literature. If the dance macabre was the painting of the period, then Boccaccio's Decameron was its novel. Written in the wake of the Black Death, this collection of tales paints a vivid picture of life and death in 14th century Italy. Imagine 10 young people fleeing the plague-ridden streets of Florence, holing up in a villa and telling each other stories to pass the time. It's like a medieval version of the Breakfast Club, but with more death and fewer detention hall shenanigans. The Decameron is a masterclass in dark humor, blending tragedy with comedy in a way that feels surprisingly modern. Boccaccio didn't shy away from the grim realities of the plague, but he also highlighted the absurdities of human nature in times of crisis. One tale features a man who decides to test his wife's fidelity by faking his own death. Spoiler, it doesn't end well for him, but beneath the humor lies a deeper message about the fragility of life and the need to find joy, even in the darkest of times. And then there's the music, because what's a dance without a soundtrack? The period saw a rise in sama, reflective compositions, often performed during religious ceremonies meant to ward off future outbreaks. These musical pieces, with their haunting melodies and solemn tones, were the medieval equivalent of a Spotify playlist curated for brooding. They reflected the collective mourning of a continent grappling with loss, yet they also offered a glimmer of hope, a reminder that life, no matter how fragile, still persisted. Let's not kid ourselves, though. Not everyone was spending their days contemplating the meaning of life through art and music. Some folks took a more practical approach to the situation, which often involved a healthy dose of gallows humor. This dark sense of humor became a survival mechanism, a way to laugh in the face of adversity when the alternative was to crumble under its weight. After all, when life hands you lemons, or in this case, a devastating pandemic, sometimes the only thing to do is make lemonade and share a laugh with your equally beleaguered neighbors. Now, before we get too swept away by the romance of plague-inspired creativity, let's debunk a few myths. For starters, not all art and literature from this period was doom and gloom. While the dance macabre and Decameron are iconic, they don't represent the entirety of the cultural output. Many works focused on themes of rebirth and renewal, reflecting a society eager to move past its darkest days. The Renaissance, which followed on the heels of the Black Death, was a period of immense cultural flourishing, fueled in part by the introspection and resilience born from the plague's devastation. Moreover, the idea that the Black Death single-handedly led to this cultural renaissance is a bit of an oversimplification. Yes, the plague was a catalyst, forcing people to rethink their priorities and values, but it was also part of a broader tapestry of historical forces. Economic changes, shifts in power dynamics, and increased trade and communication all played crucial roles in shaping post-plague Europe. The Renaissance wasn't just a reaction to the Black Death. It was the result of a complex interplay of factors that had been building for centuries. So, while it's tempting to view the Black Death as the morbid muse of European culture, the reality is far more nuanced. The plague's impact on art and literature was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that would continue to evolve long after the last bubo had healed. But there's no denying that the Black Death left an indelible mark on the cultural landscape, forcing people to confront their mortality and find meaning in the face of unimaginable loss. As we continue to unravel the story of the Black Death, remember that this is a tale of both horror and hope, of despair and resilience. The cultural impact of the plague was a reflection of these dualities, capturing the complexity of human experience in a time of unprecedented crisis. And while the past may be a foreign country, its echoes continue to resonate, reminding us that even in the darkest of times, creativity and humor can light the way forward. Stay tuned, because the story of the Black Death is far from over. We've seen how it reshaped society and culture, but there's more to explore as we delve deeper into the aftershocks of this cataclysmic event. The journey continues, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's next. As we continue to peel back the layers of the Black Death's legacy, it's clear that this wasn't just a medieval horror story. It was a seismic shift that paved the way for the modern world. Let's kick things off with the Renaissance, that dazzling era of rebirth and creativity that makes the post-plague period sound like history's version of a phoenix rising from the ashes. It's tempting to picture the Renaissance as an art gallery opening with Leonardo da Vinci serving hors d'oeuvres, but the reality was a bit more complex. The Black Death didn't single-handedly paint the Sistine Chapel or compose a symphony. It did, however, shake up the social and economic structures that made such achievements possible. With a third of the population gone, there was suddenly more wealth and resources to go around. The surviving population found themselves with more disposable income, and a market eager to cater to their desires for luxury goods and art. It was like the medieval version of a stimulus package, where death inadvertently financed creativity. But let's not go overboard with romanticizing this era. Sure, the Renaissance was a time of unprecedented artistic achievement and scientific discovery, but it was also a period rife with political power plays and social upheaval. The Black Death had left a power vacuum that ambitious rulers were all too eager to fill. In Italy, city-states like Florence and Venice thrived, bolstered by trade and a burgeoning middle class. The Medici family, for instance, rose to prominence through banking and commerce, becoming patrons of the arts and wielding influence that rivaled kings. It was a game of thrones played in the shadow of a pandemic, where power was the ultimate currency. Yet, the Renaissance wasn't just an artistic renaissance, it was an intellectual one too. The scarcity of laborers led to innovations in agriculture and industry, as people sought to do more with less. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century, revolutionized the way knowledge was disseminated, making books more accessible and literacy rates soar. Ideas spread faster than ever before, and the seeds of the scientific revolution were sown in the fertile ground left by the plague's upheaval. Speaking of science, here's where we take a hard left into the realm of modern epidemiology. The Black Death's brutal efficiency at wiping out populations forced a reconsideration of how diseases spread and how they could be prevented. While medieval physicians didn't crack the code on germ theory, spoiler alert, that wouldn't come until the 19th century, their struggles laid the groundwork for future breakthroughs. Quarantine, derived from the Italian quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days, became a common practice in port cities like Venice, where ships suspected of carrying plague were isolated to prevent the spread of disease. It was a rudimentary form of public health policy, and it worked well enough to become a staple in disease control for centuries. Fast forward to today, and the echoes of the Black Death can still be heard in the field of epidemiology. The lessons learned, or ignored, during the medieval pandemic inform modern responses to outbreaks. Concepts like social distancing, isolation, and quarantine have become part of our everyday vocabulary, a testament to the enduring legacy of a disease that once brought Europe to its knees. The difference now is that we have the tools and knowledge to combat such threats more effectively, transforming what was once an unstoppable force into a manageable challenge. Now, let's take a moment to bust a few myths. The idea that the Black Death was a singular event that reshaped Europe overnight is a bit of a historical exaggeration. The truth is, change was already in the air before the plague struck. The 14th century was a time of social and economic unrest, with peasant revolts, wars, and a church whose authority was increasingly questioned. The plague accelerated these developments, acting as a catalyst rather than the sole cause. The Renaissance and subsequent societal shifts were the result of multiple factors, including the rediscovery of classical texts and a growing curiosity about the natural world. But why does the Black Death still captivate us today? Perhaps it's because the story of the plague is both cautionary and inspiring. It's a reminder of humanity's vulnerability to nature's whims, but also of our capacity to adapt and overcome. The Black Death was a disaster of unimaginable proportions, yet it also sparked a period of incredible growth and innovation. It's a duality that resonates with us, particularly in an age where global pandemics are no longer just the stuff of history books. In the end, the Black Death's legacy is one of transformation. It reshaped the world in ways that medieval Europeans could never have envisioned, setting the stage for the modern era. From the ashes of devastation rose a society that was more dynamic, more interconnected, and more resilient. It wasn't a clean break from the past, but rather a continuation of humanity's ongoing journey, a journey marked by periods of darkness and light. So, what can we learn from this chapter of history? Perhaps it's that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, there lies an opportunity for renewal. The Black Death was a stark reminder that life is fragile, yet it also underscored our remarkable ability to rise from the depths of despair, to reinvent and reimagine our future. It's a lesson that holds as true today as it did in the 14th century, proving once again that the past is never truly past. It's a living, breathing part of who we are. And there you have it, the Black Death's legacy in a nutshell. A devastating tragedy that sowed the seeds of transformation, a cataclysm that forced humanity to confront its mortality, and in doing so, laid the groundwork for a brighter future. It's a story that's both sobering and hopeful, a reminder that history is not just a record of what happened, but a guide to what could be. If you took a stroll through ancient Greece around 600 BCE, you'd find yourself in a world where thinking was the hardest new trend, and no one was quite sure what it meant yet. Picture this. Philosophers were the influencers of the day, but instead of posting selfies, they pondered the mysteries of the universe. Our story kicks off with a group of thinkers known as the Pre-Socratics. These intellectual trailblazers, like Thales and Pythagoras, weren't just sitting around in togas all day. They were laying the groundwork for Western philosophy. Let's face it, without their deep dives into the nature of existence, our modern world might still be stuck wondering why things fall when you drop them. Thales, often dubbed the first philosopher, was the guy who dared to ask, "What's the world made of?" His answer, water. Now, before you laugh him off as a primitive aquaphile, consider this. Thales was living in Miletus, a city where water wasn't just a life source. It was a trade route, a means of agriculture, and likely the closest thing they had to Wi-Fi. It was essential. So, it made perfect sense for him to think water was the foundational element of everything. And frankly, in a world where olive oil often served as currency, he was already thinking outside the amphora. Jumping over to Pythagoras. He's the mathlete you might remember from that time your geometry teacher tried to make triangles exciting. Pythagoras didn't just discover that a 2 plus b2 equals c2. He basically started a cult dedicated to numbers. Seriously, these guys were like the original math club, except instead of pocket protectors, they had secret rituals and a belief in the transmigration of souls. The Pythagoreans were convinced that numbers were the essence of all things, and reality could be understood through mathematics. In a world where the concept of zero was still a millennium away, this was revolutionary thinking. Or as revolutionary as you can get when your convinced beings are evil incarnate. But before we get lost in the romanticized haze of solitary geniuses, let's talk about the messy reality of ancient Greek intellectual life. These philosophers weren't lone wolves scribbling wisdom on parchments under olive trees. They were more like the original think tank, collaborating and debating in public spaces like the agora, the Greek version of a bustling coffee shop, or your local Twitter feed. Ideas bounced around like a philosophical pinball machine, with thinkers building off each other's musings. Thales and his buddies were part of a vibrant intellectual community that was as much about argument and dialogue as it was about solitary reflection. The practical realities of their world can't be ignored either. Greece wasn't just a sun-drenched playground for toga-clad thinkers. It was a patchwork of city-states, each with its own quirks and conflicts. The economy was a mix of agriculture, trade and production, with olive oil, wine and pottery playing starring roles. Democracy was emerging as a radical experiment in governance, though in its early days it was more of a beta version. Athenian democracy, for instance, was exclusive and experimental, much like an early access game with limited slots available only to Athenian male citizens. These philosophers were steeped in a culture that was constantly asking questions about gods, the cosmos, and human nature itself. Their world was a curious blend of myth and reason. For every logical deduction, there was a mythological story about Zeus throwing thunderbolts, or Athena springing fully formed from her father's head. The Greeks loved a good story, but they also loved picking it apart, dissecting every detail to see if it held up to scrutiny. It was this curiosity, this willingness to question everything, that set the stage for a philosophical revolution. So, while it's tempting to picture these early thinkers as solitary hermits lost in thought, the reality was far more dynamic and social. Their ideas were forged in the fires of debate and discussion, shaped by the economic and political pressures of their time. The legacy they left behind isn't just about the content of their ideas, but the method of inquiry they championed, a relentless pursuit of knowledge through dialogue and reason. And that, dear listener, is why we're still talking about them today, long after the olive oil has run dry and the agora has fallen silent. And speaking of relentless pursuits, let's jump straight into the minds of the big three, the philosophical heavyweights of ancient Greece, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. These guys were the original thought leaders, the intellectual equivalent of a rock band with a cult following. Their ideas didn't just echo through the marble halls of Athens. They ricocheted across centuries, shaping the very foundation of Western philosophy. So, buckle up as we dive into the cerebral circus that is their legacy. First up, Socrates. If you've ever met someone who answers every question with another question, you've met a disciple of Socrates. The man was notorious for his method of inquiry, which was less about finding answers and more about shining a spotlight on how little anyone actually knew. His approach, known as the Socratic method, was a bit like philosophical jiu-jitsu, using his opponent's momentum against them until they were tied up in their own contradictions. Socrates didn't write anything down, which is a real shame for historians, but a brilliant way to make sure his ideas stayed fresh in the minds of his students. Instead, his teachings come to us through the writings of his star pupil, who was none other than Plato. Now, imagine Athens in the 5th century BCE. It's a place where the height of fashion is a toga, political intrigue is as common as olive groves, and where someone like Socrates can walk around barefoot, questioning the very fabric of society. The man was a gadfly, a term he himself used, constantly buzzing around the Athenian marketplace, or agora, challenging everyone from the humblest craftsman to the mightiest statesman. This didn't exactly win him friends in high places. In 399 BCE, Socrates was sentenced to death, accused of corrupting the youth and impiety. The trial and execution of Socrates had become emblematic of the tension between free thought and societal norms. His death was a dramatic curtain call that left his followers and critics alike grappling with his legacy. Enter Plato, the philosopher who took Socrates' questions and ran with them all the way to the academy, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world. Plato wasn't just about asking questions. He wanted answers, preferably ones that could fit into a neat, idealistic framework. He's the guy who gave us the allegory of the cave, a metaphor for human ignorance and enlightenment, where most people are content to watch shadows, while philosophers strive to see the objects casting them. Plato's idealism was all about seeking the perfect forms, the true essence of things, beyond the flawed physical world we inhabit. But let's not get too starry-eyed. While the notion of philosopher kings ruling the world sounds great in theory. It's a bit like suggesting that today's academic conferences should govern nations. Plato's vision was born out of the chaos of Athenian democracy, which was more of a political roller coaster than a steady ship. He saw firsthand the damage that demagoguery and mob rule could do, and his idealism was a reaction to the messy reality of politics. Plato's writings touch on everything from justice and virtue to the nature of the soul, offering a blueprint for an ideal state that's as much a critique of Athens as it is a philosophical utopia. And then there's Aristotle, Plato's star pupil, who decided that idealism was all well and good, but reality needed a bit more attention. If Socrates was the questioner and Plato the dreamer, Aristotle was the scientist. He was a polymath, dipping his toes into everything from biology to ethics to political theory. Aristotle believed in empirical observation and logic, laying the groundwork for what would eventually become the scientific method. His approach was like a philosophical Swiss Army knife, applicable to any situation, whether it was dissecting a squid or debating the nature of happiness. Aristotle's school, the Lyceum, was a bustling hub of intellectual activity. Unlike his predecessors, Aristotle wasn't content to stay in the realm of abstract ideas. He wanted data, evidence, and practical application. His writings on ethics, politics, and metaphysics are a treasure trove of insights, and his work on logic, particularly his theory of syllogism, was revolutionary. He believed that the universe had an inherent order, a hierarchy that could be understood through careful study and reasoned analysis. These three thinkers weren't just ivory tower philosophers. They were deeply embedded in the socio-political fabric of Athens. Socrates lived in a city-state perpetually at war, where every citizen was expected to contribute to the defense, while Plato's and Aristotle's lives were shaped by the political upheavals that followed. The Peloponnesian War, the fall of Athens, and the rise of Macedonian power under Philip Roman II all played pivotal roles in their philosophical musings. The economic context was equally critical. Athens wasn't just the birthplace of democracy. It was a bustling trade center with a complex economy that relied heavily on slaves, a fact that doesn't mesh well with our modern ideals, but was a reality of their world. The wealth generated by trade and war fueled the philosophical pursuits of these thinkers, even as they questioned the very nature of the society that supported them. So, while it's tempting to romanticize these philosophers as detached geniuses, the truth is they were very much products of their time. Their ideas were responses to the chaos and complexity of their world, a world where a toga was more than fashion. It was a symbol of citizenship and status. And political scandals, well, those were as common as the Mediterranean sun. From the trial of Socrates to the political machinations that Plato witnessed, these events were the backdrop against which their philosophies were forged. Despite the veneer of idealism, the harsh reality was that Athens was a city-state in turmoil, where intellectual pursuits were constantly under threat from the vicissitudes of politics and war. Yet, it was precisely this tension between ideal and reality, between question and answer, that propelled Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle to heights of philosophical thought that continue to resonate today. Their legacy is not just in the ideas they championed, but in the method of inquiry they perfected, a relentless pursuit of truth in a world that was anything but straightforward. And that, dear listener, is just the beginning of their story. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into their philosophies and the lasting impact they have had on the world. As the curtain falls on the classical era, we pivot to the Hellenistic period, where Greek philosophy becomes the intellectual equivalent of a top-charting pop hit. Picture Alexander the Great as the ultimate influencer, his conquest spreading Greek thought faster than you can say world domination. By 323 BCE, Alexander's empire stretched from Greece to Egypt and all the way to India, creating a cultural mashup that would make even the most ambitious fusion chef blush. Alexandria, the city he founded in Egypt, becomes the intellectual hub of this new world, a melting pot where Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and Indian traditions collide, creating a philosophical jamboree. Now, let's dig into how this cultural exchange played out. For starters, getting from Athens to Alexandria was no small feat. We're talking a 700-mile journey across the Mediterranean, which, in ancient terms, was like booking a one-way ticket to the moon, but with the promise of new trade routes, and intellectual riches, scholars and merchants alike were drawn to Alexandria like moths to a flame. The city's famous library, a treasure trove of scrolls and knowledge, was the brainchild of Ptolemy I, one of Alexander's generals who decided to set up shop as a pharaoh after Alexander's untimely demise. Speaking of untimely, let's bust the myth that Alexander was some sort of philosopher king. Sure, he was tutored by Aristotle, but Alexander's real passions were conquest and glory, not deep dives into existential questions. The man was more interested in naming cities after himself. Over 20 Alexandrias dart the ancient map than pondering the nature of the soul. Yet, his campaigns inadvertently spread Greek culture and philosophy, making him an unwitting patron of the arts and sciences. Enter the Stoics and Epicureans, who emerged as philosophical heavyweights in this era of cultural cross-pollination. The Stoics, founded by Zeno of Citium around 300 BCE, were the ancient world's equivalent of motivational speakers, preaching the virtues of self-control and rationality. They might have had a field day on Instagram, posting daily affirmations about embracing fate and finding inner peace amidst chaos. Stoicism's appeal was universal. It offered a philosophical toolkit for navigating life's trials, especially in a world where political upheaval was as common as the Nile's flooding. Then there were the Epicureans, led by Epicurus himself, who took a decidedly different approach. If the Stoics were all about enduring life's slings and arrows, Epicurus and his crew were more inclined to dodge them entirely. Their philosophy was a blend of hedonism and practicality, emphasizing the pursuit of pleasure, not the overindulgent kind, mind you, but a balanced life free from pain and fear. Epicurus' garden, his school and community, was a sanctuary for those seeking tranquility away from the hustle and bustle of city life. It's a little ironic that the man who preached simple pleasures had a following that would rival a modern-day wellness guru. But let's not get swept away by the romanticism of these philosophical schools. The Hellenistic period was anything but a peaceful time of unbridled intellectual exploration. It was an era marked by constant warfare, political intrigue, and economic uncertainty. The Diadochi, Alexander's successors, were more interested in carving up his empire than fostering philosophical debates. The power struggles between these former generals were epic, both in scale and in impact, leading to the creation of several Hellenistic kingdoms, each vying for dominance. Economically, the era was a mixed bag. On one hand, the expansion of trade routes facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas like never before. On the other hand, the constant state of war drained resources and destabilized regions. The famous Silk Road began to take shape, linking the East and West, but it was a perilous journey fraught with bandits and the ever-present risk of political upheaval. Meanwhile, the local economies of these newly minted kingdoms were often strained by heavy taxation and the demands of maintaining large standing armies. Politically, the landscape was a Game of Thrones long before George R.R. Martin penned his epic. The Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Persia, and the Antigonids in Macedonia were forever locked in a dance of alliances, betrayals, and power grabs. In this volatile environment, philosophers weren't just pondering the nature of existence. They were navigating a world where philosophical allegiances could be as dangerous as political ones. Being branded a follower of a particular school could align you with certain political factions, making the agora a more treacherous place than ever. Despite these challenges, the cross-cultural interactions catalyzed by Alexander's conquests led to some truly groundbreaking developments. The fusion of Greek and Eastern philosophies gave rise to new ways of thinking about the world. In India, for instance, the encounter with Greek thought contributed to the development of Greco-Buddhism, blending Hellenistic and Buddhist elements in art and philosophy. In Egypt, the melding of Greek and Egyptian traditions led to advances in science and medicine, epitomized by the work of figures like Euclid and Archimedes, whose contributions to mathematics and engineering were monumental. However, the notion that this period was a harmonious blending of cultures is, frankly, a bit of a fairy tale. The reality was more like a cultural stew simmering at just below boiling point, with tensions between different ethnic and cultural groups never far from the surface. In Alexandria, for instance, Clashes between Greek and Jewish communities were not uncommon, a reflection of the broader struggles for cultural dominance that characterized the era. So, while the Hellenistic period was a time of significant philosophical growth, it was also an era of conflict and contradiction. The ideas that emerged were shaped by a world in flux, where the boundaries between cultures were both porous and contentious. It was a time when philosophers had to be as savvy politically as they were intellectually, navigating a landscape where the wrong word could land you in hot water, or worse. And yet, out of this cauldron of chaos and creativity, Greek philosophy continued to evolve, adapting and thriving in new contexts. The Stoics and Epicureans, along with other schools like the Skeptics and Cynics, offered frameworks for understanding a world that was constantly shifting. Their teachings resonated far beyond the Hellenistic world, influencing Roman thought and eventually the entire Western tradition. As we wrap up this whirlwind tour of the Hellenistic period, it's clear that Greek philosophy was anything but static. Like a viral meme, it morphed and spread, touching every corner of the known world. And while the era was fraught with challenges, it was also one of unparalleled intellectual ferment, setting the stage for the philosophical developments that would follow. But hold onto your sandals, dear listener, because the story is far from over. Next up, we'll explore how these ideas continue to evolve and influence the Roman world, paving the way for the philosophical traditions that still shape our thinking today. So stay tuned as we dive into the next chapter of this epic saga of thought and transformation. As Greek philosophy began to weave its way into the Roman Empire like a viral TikTok trend, it was clear that the Romans were eager to put their own spin on these time-tested ideas. And to the Roman thinkers, ready to remix Greek philosophy for a new audience, picture a bustling Roman marketplace, where instead of street performers and merchants hawking goods, you had philosophers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius waxing poetic about Stoicism, while the masses prepared for another round of gladiatorial combat. It was a weird juxtaposition, sure, but somehow it worked, like pineapple on pizza. Now, let's set the stage. Roman society, circa the 1st century CE, was a hotbed of power politics, with emperors battling for control, senators plotting like it was a season of House of Cards, and the plebs just trying to keep their heads down amidst the chaos. It was a time when bread and circuses kept the public pacified, and philosophy provided a much-needed respite from the madness. But here's the kicker. Roman philosophers weren't just copying their Greek predecessors. They were adapting their teachings to fit the unique pressures of their sprawling empire. Take Seneca, for instance. He was born in 4 BCE in Corduba, Hispania, and eventually rose to become one of the most prominent Stoic philosophers of his time. Seneca was a real Renaissance man, before the Renaissance was even a thing. He was a playwright, a statesman, and a tutor to none other than Emperor Nero. Talk about wearing multiple togas. Seneca's writings, particularly his essays and letters, emphasized the importance of virtue, reason, and self-control, which must have seemed like revolutionary ideas in a world where decadence was the norm and gladiators were the reality TV stars of the day. Seneca's philosophy was all about finding peace amidst chaos, a concept that resonated with a Roman society that often seemed on the brink of collapse. His essays on anger and the shortness of life were essentially ancient self-help books, offering guidance on how to maintain one's composure when the political waters got choppy, a common occurrence in Rome, where emperors could rise and fall faster than a chariot race. Seneca's life, however, was a lesson in irony. Despite his teachings on moderation and virtue, he amassed a considerable fortune and was entangled in court intrigues, leading to his forced suicide in 65 CE under Nero's orders. A sobering reminder that, in Rome, even philosophers weren't immune to the whims of the powerful. Then there's Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who ruled from 161 to 180 CE. Often romanticized as the quintessential philosopher king, think of him as a cross between Marcus Garvey and a Jedi master. Marcus Aurelius is perhaps best known for his work, Meditations. Written in Greek during military campaigns, Meditations is a collection of personal reflections that reveal a man grappling with the burdens of power while striving for stoic virtue. They offer a rare glimpse into the mind of a ruler trying to maintain philosophical integrity in the face of imperial responsibilities. But let's not get too carried away with the notion of Marcus as the benevolent philosopher king. While his reign is often seen as a golden age, the reality was far more complex. The Roman Empire during his rule was beset by wars, plagues, and economic troubles. It's like trying to run a multinational corporation while also writing a self-help book. No easy feat. Marcus Aurelius's philosophical musings were born out of necessity, a coping mechanism for the relentless pressures of leadership. The philosopher king myth is tempting, offering a vision of a ruler guided by wisdom and virtue rather than ambition and greed. But in reality, Roman emperors were more often shaped by the harsh realities of power politics than by philosophical ideals. They had to navigate treacherous waters, balancing the demands of military campaigns, political rivals, and public opinion, all while maintaining the facade of divine authority. It's no wonder they needed a philosophical anchor. Beyond the individual philosophers, Greek ideas also influenced Roman education, politics, and culture. Wealthy elite sent their children to study under Greek tutors, ensuring that the next generation would be well versed in the classics. The Roman Senate, that august body of statesmen and schemers, often engaged in debates that would make Socrates proud, or at least amused. Even the legal system was infused with philosophical reasoning, as Roman jurists drew on Stoic principles to argue for justice and equity. Economically, the Roman Empire was a colossal machine, fueled by trade, slavery, and conquest. The Mediterranean Sea, dubbed Mare Nostrum by the Romans, was their highway to wealth, facilitating the movement of goods, people, and ideas across vast distances. The empire's prosperity allowed for the patronage of the arts and sciences, creating a fertile ground for philosophical inquiry. But it was also a time of stark inequalities, where the gap between the wealthy elite and the impoverished masses was as wide as the Colosseum. In this context, philosophy offered a rarefied escape, a way to rise above the materialism and decadence that defined Roman society. Debunking the myth of the peaceful, enlightened Roman philosopher king doesn't diminish their achievements. Rather, it highlights the resilience of philosophy in a world that was anything but serene. These thinkers managed to carve out a space for introspection and wisdom amidst the clamor of empire, a testament to the enduring power of ideas, even in the most turbulent times. As the Roman Empire continued to expand, so too did its cultural horizons. Greek philosophy became a lingua franca of sorts, transcending linguistic and cultural boundaries. It was a testament to the universality of its themes, the search for truth, the nature of virtue, and the quest for a meaningful life. These ideas were as relevant in the bustling streets of Rome as they were in the dusty marketplaces of Athens or the sprawling villas of the Roman countryside. And let's not forget the cultural mashup that ensued as Roman and Greek traditions intermingled. The Romans were nothing if not pragmatic, and they cherry-picked the best of Greek thought, blending it with their own customs to create a rich tapestry of intellectual and cultural life. The result was a vibrant, cosmopolitan society where philosophy was not just an abstract pursuit, but a practical guide to living well. Yet, while the Romans were busy philosophizing, they were also building an empire that stretched from Britannia to Egypt. The Roman road network alone covered over 250,000 miles, a feat of engineering that facilitated the movement of troops, goods, and ideas. It's a reminder that while the Romans may have adopted Greek philosophy, they did so with an eye on practical application, ensuring that their empire ran as smoothly as a well-oiled chariot. The Romans were masters of adaptation, and their embrace of Greek philosophy was no exception. They took what was useful, discarded what wasn't, and made it their own, creating a legacy that would shape the Western world for centuries to come. But as we look back on this fascinating chapter in history, it's important to remember that behind the romanticized image of philosopher kings and enlightened rulers lay a world of complexity, contradiction, and, yes, chaos. So, as we prepare to close the book on this part of our journey, remember this. History is as much about the stories we tell ourselves as it is about the facts. The Romans, with their love of spectacle and drama, understood this better than most. They knew that the story of their empire and its philosophy will be one of triumph and tragedy, wisdom and folly. And in that sense, the Roman legacy is as much a reflection of our own human nature as it is an account of their achievements. But don't hang up your toga just yet. There's more to explore in this epic saga. As we move forward, we'll dive into the final chapter of Greek philosophy's journey, tracing its influence through the Middle Ages and beyond, as it continues to shape the modern world in ways both profound and unexpected. So, stay tuned, dear listener, as we unravel the next threads in this rich tapestry of thought and transformation. As we unravel the next threads in this rich tapestry of thought and transformation, it's time to cast our gaze forward, past the crumbling arches of the Roman Empire, into an era where Greek philosophy would undergo its own renaissance. Literally, fast forward to the Renaissance period, a time when Europe decided it was high time to dust off the ancient scrolls and give old ideas a new spin. This was the intellectual equivalent of finding a box of vintage records in your grandma's attic and realizing they're cooler than anything on Spotify today. The Renaissance, spanning roughly from the 14th to the 17th century, was a period where the past and present collided in a kaleidoscope of art, science, and, of course, philosophy. The rediscovery of Greek and Roman texts, many of which had been preserved by Islamic scholars during the Middle Ages, was like striking intellectual gold. And who were the miners in this cultural gold rush? Thinkers like Petrarch, who, in the 1300, declared a new dawn of learning by diving headfirst into the works of Cicero and Plato. By the way, if you ever hear someone lamenting the loss of the Dark Ages, thank Petrarch's flair for the dramatic. He almost single-handedly branded that era with such a dim moniker. With the Renaissance came a vibrant exchange of ideas, fueled by the advent of the printing press in the 15th century. Johannes Gutenberg's invention was a game-changer, making knowledge as accessible as the latest TikTok trend. Suddenly, the musings of Aristotle and Plato were not just the exclusive domain of dusty scholars, but were available to anyone with the price of a book. For example, by 1500, around 20 million volumes had been printed in Europe, an impressive feat considering the medieval equivalent might have involved scribes, quills, and a whole lot of candle wax. But let's not romanticize this intellectual revival as an era of pure enlightenment. The Renaissance was also a time of tumultuous change, with Europe emerging from the shadows of feudalism into the light of centralized states and expanding economies. The Italian city-states, like Florence and Venice, were bustling hubs of trade and finance, where bankers were as influential as bishops. It was in this dynamic environment that the seeds of modernity were sown, with Greek philosophy acting as both fertilizer and inspiration. Renaissance thinkers weren't simply resurrecting ancient ideas, they were remixing them, much like a DJ takes an old classic and adds a fresh beat. Take, for instance, the humanists, who saw in Greek philosophy a roadmap for understanding the human condition. Figures like Erasmus and Thomas more championed the idea that human reason could lead to moral and societal improvement. They weren't content to simply accept the status quo. They sought to question and reform it, drawing on the Socratic tradition of inquiry. And then there was the scientific revolution, where Greek thought provided the philosophical underpinning for a new way of understanding the world. Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton, these scientific mavericks stood on the shoulders of giants like Aristotle, even as they overturned some of his long-held beliefs. The heliocentric model proposed by Copernicus, which placed the sun at the center of the universe instead of Earth, was a radical departure from Aristotelian cosmology. Yet, the very method of systematic observation and hypothesis testing owed much to Aristotle's insistence on empirical data. The legacy of Greek philosophy didn't just stop at the doorstep of science. It knocked down the door and redecorated the whole house. Consider the Enlightenment, the intellectual movement that followed the Renaissance and fundamentally reshaped Western thought. Philosophers like John Locke, Immanuel Kant, and Voltaire were the heirs of a tradition that prized reason and evidence over superstition and dogma. They championed ideals that would become the bedrock of modern democracy, such as the separation of church and state and the social contract. But before you get too carried away with the notion of Enlightenment thinkers as purely rational beings, remember this: they were as much a product of their time as the ancient Greeks were of theirs. The Enlightenment was an era of colonial expansion, industrialization, and social upheaval. The very men who penned treatises on liberty and equality often turned a blind eye to the harsh realities of imperialism and slavery. It's a reminder that even the most enlightened minds can be clouded by the prejudices of their era. Now, let's fast forward to today, where Greek philosophy still casts a long shadow over our modern world. In our legal systems, the echoes of Athenian democracy can be heard in the hallowed halls of courtrooms and legislative chambers. The principle of trial by jury, for instance, has roots in ancient Greece, where citizens took turns judging their peers, a practice that continues to influence legal proceedings in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom. In the realm of science, the legacy of Greek thought is indelible. The scientific method, a cornerstone of modern research, is deeply rooted in the empirical and rational approaches pioneered by Aristotle and his intellectual descendants. Every time a scientist sets up an experiment or formulates a hypothesis, they are unwittingly paying homage to the thinkers of ancient Greece, who insisted that understanding the natural world required observation, reason, and a healthy dose of skepticism. Even in the throes of modern existential crises, Greek philosophy offers solace and guidance. The Stoic teachings of Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, with their emphasis on accepting what cannot be changed and focusing on what can, resonate in today's world of uncertainty and anxiety. In an age where social media can make life's trials feel amplified and relentless, the Stoic call for inner peace and resilience is more relevant than ever. Yet, as we celebrate the enduring influence of Greek philosophy, let's not forget the messy, collaborative process that brought these ideas to life. The romantic image of the philosopher as a lone genius, pondering the mysteries of existence in splendid isolation, is a myth. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were part of vibrant intellectual communities that debated, argued, and refined their ideas through dialogue and collaboration. It was a process as dynamic and interconnected as the agora itself. In the end, the legacy of Greek philosophy is not just about the ideas that have survived the test of time, but the method of inquiry they championed, a relentless pursuit of knowledge through reasoned dialogue and critical thinking. It's a tradition that has evolved and adapted over millennia, influencing countless generations of thinkers and shaping the very fabric of Western thought. So, as we draw this journey to a close, remember this. The story of Greek philosophy is a testament to the power of ideas to transcend time and space, to inspire and challenge, to illuminate the complexities of the human condition. It's a reminder that while the world may change, the quest for understanding remains a constant, an eternal dialogue that continues to unfold, one question at a time. And with that, dear listener, we bid farewell to this chapter of history, hoping that the echoes of ancient Greece will linger in your thoughts as they have in ours. Nelson Mandela was born in a small village called Mvizo on July 18, 1918, into the Thembu royal family. Now, don't go picturing palaces and velvet robes just yet. Royalty in this context meant more responsibility than luxury. His father, Gadler Henry Mfakaniaswa, was an advisor to the Thembu king, which sounds important until you realize that being a royal advisor in rural Transkei was less Game of Thrones and more where's my next meal coming from. But what Mandela inherited from his father was something far more valuable than riches, a rebellious streak and a deep sense of justice. Now, let's talk about Mandela's education, a journey as winding and unpredictable as a soap opera plot twist. Young Nelson, or Ralehlala as he was originally named, meaning troublemaker in Xhosa, was the first in his family to attend school. At the tender age of 7, he was sent to a Methodist school where his teacher, in a move typical of colonial influence, decided that Ralehlala just wouldn't do. And so, Nelson Mandela was christened with a new name, one that would eventually become synonymous with resilience and freedom. Fast forward to 1939. Mandela enrolled at the University of Fort Hare, one of the few higher education institutions available to black South Africans at the time. If you think college was all about cramming for exams and surviving on instant noodles, Mandela's experience was a bit different. Sure, there were books and lectures, but there was also a bubbling cauldron of political activism. Fort Hare was a breeding ground for future African leaders, and Mandela was about to get a crash course in defiance. In his second year, Mandela found himself swept up in a student protest against university policies. This wasn't your average no more homework revolt. It was a full-blown stand against the administration's attempts to limit the powers of the student council. Mandela, true to his name, was one of the ringleaders. The protest was a bold move, and it came with consequences. The university, perhaps not appreciating the students' flair for democratic expression, expelled Mandela in 1940. Now, you might think getting expelled would be a career-ending move, but for Mandela, it was just the beginning of a lifetime of sticking it to the man. He returned home, unsure of what to do next, only to find that his guardian had arranged a marriage for him, something Mandela had no intention of going through with. So, what did he do? The only logical thing. Of course, he ran away to Johannesburg. In Johannesburg, Mandela worked as a night watchman and a clerk. Not exactly glamorous gigs, but they kept him afloat while he pursued a law degree by correspondence. It was here, amidst the hustle and bustle of the city, that Mandela began to see the harsh realities of apartheid up close. The racial divide wasn't just a line in a history book. It was a daily, grinding reality. It was also in Johannesburg that Mandela met members of the African National Congress, ANC, setting him on a path that would forever change South Africa. Mandela's early life reads like the origin story of a superhero, minus the capes and superpowers. Instead of X-ray vision or flying, Mandela's powers were resilience and determination. He was a man who faced expulsion not as a setback, but as a stepping stone to greater things. And while he didn't have a secret lair, he did have a secret weapon, an unyielding spirit, and a knack for turning adversity into opportunity. So, as we delve deeper into Mandela's life, remember, the makings of a hero aren't just in the extraordinary. They're in the everyday choices and the relentless pursuit of justice. And so, with a spirit as unyielding as a stubborn mule on a hot day, young Nelson Mandela found himself in Johannesburg, that bustling city where opportunity and oppression played a never-ending game of tag. It was here that Mandela's political career took root, and like any good story, it began with a twist of fate and a dash of serendipity. In the 1940s, Johannesburg was a city of stark contrasts, where the smoke-belching mines and gleaming skyscrapers stood in sharp relief against the sprawling townships. It was in this complex urban landscape that Mandela joined the African National Congress, ANC, an organization that, much like him, was beginning to find its voice. The ANC, founded in 1912, was originally about as impactful as a whisper in a hurricane. But by the time Mandela came along, the winds of change were starting to gust, and the organization needed fresh blood to stir things up. Enter the ANC Youth League, a feisty group of young radicals who were ready to give the status quo a run for its money. Founded in 1944, the Youth League was all about action, not just rhetoric. Mandela, with his law degree in progress and a knack for persuasion that could sell ice to an Eskimo, quickly rose through the ranks. Alongside other future luminaries like Oliver Tambo and Walter Sisulu, Mandela helped craft a new vision for the ANC, one that wasn't afraid to ruffle feathers. The Youth League was like the rebellious teenager of political movements, eager to break away from the cautious strategies of its elders. They pushed for a more confrontational approach to tackling apartheid, advocating for boycotts, strikes, and civil disobedience. This was the era when Mandela began to shine as a leader, not just in defiance, but in strategy. He was the kind of guy who could see 5 moves ahead on the chessboard and still charm his opponent into a friendly handshake afterward. But let's not sugarcoat it. This was dangerous business. Opposing apartheid in South Africa wasn't just a matter of signing petitions and holding peaceful marches. It was a full-contact sport with real stakes. The government, not exactly known for its sense of humor or tolerance, had a habit of cracking down on dissent with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. For Mandela, this meant living life with one eye on the future and the other on the rearview mirror, always ready to hit the ground running. And run he did. In the early 1950s, Mandela's life became the stuff of spy novels. He earned the nickname the Black Pimpernel, a nod to his ability to evade arrest despite being one of the most wanted men in the country. Imagine trying to organize a movement while simultaneously avoiding a government that would love nothing more than to see you behind bars. Mandela moved from safe house to safe house, often disguised as a chauffeur or a gardener, roles that, ironically, were among the few available to black South Africans at the time. Yet, Even in this cloak-and-dagger existence, Mandela's resolve never wavered. He was part of the Defiance Campaign of 1952, a movement orchestrated by the ANC to peacefully resist apartheid laws. It was a bit like playing chicken with an oncoming train, but the campaign managed to draw international attention to South Africa's injustices. Mandela, with his rhetorical flair and commanding presence, was at the forefront, becoming a household name for those following the struggle. But being a revolutionary wasn't without its costs. Mandela's law practice, which he had started with his friend Oliver Tambo, suffered as clients were understandably wary of being associated with a man perpetually under police surveillance. And then there were the constant arrests, like that time in 1956, when Mandela and 155 other anti-apartheid activists were charged with treason. It was a trial that dragged on for 4 years, a veritable legal soap opera that eventually ended in acquittal. But the message from the government was clear. They might not have succeeded this time, but they weren't going to stop trying. Through it all, Mandela remained undeterred. He understood that the fight against apartheid was a marathon, not a sprint. And while he was willing to play the long game, he never lost sight of the goal, a democratic South Africa where all citizens, regardless of color, had equal rights. So, as we continue this journey through Mandela's life, remember that his story isn't just about the grand gestures and public triumphs. It's about the quiet moments of resilience and the unyielding belief that justice, no matter how long it takes, will ultimately prevail. Mandela wasn't just a man of action. He was a man of vision, and his early political career set the stage for the seismic shifts that would follow. Stay tuned, because the tale of Mandela's unyielding spirit is just getting started. As Mandela's early political career laid the groundwork for his historic journey, the stakes were about to get even higher. Let's dive into one of the most dramatic episodes in the saga, the Rivonia trial of 1963-64. Now, if you think courtroom drama is just for TV, this was the real deal, complete with high stakes, unexpected twists, and a verdict that could change the course of a nation. Rivonia trial was named after the Rivonia suburb of Johannesburg, where police uncovered a treasure trove of incriminating documents at a place called Lillisleaf Farm. This wasn't your average farmhouse. It was the clandestine HQ of the ANC's armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, which Mandela had co-founded in 1961. The government pounced on this discovery faster than a cat on a laser pointer, leading to the arrest of Mandela and other key figures. Here's where the absurdity comes in. Mandela was already serving a 5-year sentence for leaving the country without a passport and inciting workers' strikes. But this time, the charges were much heavier: sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government, with the not-so-subtle hint of the death penalty dangling over their heads. The trial began in October 1963, with Mandela and his co-defendants facing a legal system about as biased as a referee who moonlights as the opposing team's coach. The courtroom was a microcosm of apartheid South Africa, complete with a judge who was, let's say, less than sympathetic to their cause. But Mandela, ever the strategist, saw this as an opportunity to speak not just to the court, but to the world. On April 20, 1964, Mandela delivered a speech that would echo through history. Wearing a traditional karos, a sheepskin cloak symbolic of his Xhosa heritage, he stood before the court and declared, "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal for which I hope to live for, but my lord, if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." Now, let's unpack that moment. Mandela wasn't just defending himself. He was making a case for the millions oppressed under apartheid. It was a defiant stand, a verbal middle finger to a system built on inequality. The world took notice, and the trial became a global sensation, shining a harsh spotlight on South Africa's racial policies. Despite the rousing speeches and international pressure, the verdict came down hard. In June 1964, Mandela and 7 others were sentenced to life imprisonment. No death penalty, but a life sentence in South Africa at the time meant being buried alive in the prison system. They were shipped off to Robben Island, a desolate rock off the coast of Cape Town, infamous for housing political prisoners in conditions that made a flea-infested motel look like a 5-star resort. Life on Robben Island was a test of human endurance. The prison authorities seemed to have a PhD in making life miserable. Mandela and his fellow inmates were confined to tiny cells, forced into backbreaking labor in the lime quarries, where the sun's glare was blinding enough to damage their eyesight permanently. As if the physical toll wasn't enough, there was the psychological warfare. Letters and visits from family were scarce, and every word was scrutinized by censors with a penchant for red ink. But even in this bleak setting, Mandela's spirit was unyielding. He and his comrades found ingenious ways to maintain morale and outwit their captors. Take, for instance, the communication system, a masterclass in creativity. Messages were smuggled in and out of the prison in the most unlikely of ways, hidden inside tennis balls, buried in the sand, or tucked into the pages of books. It was like a high-stakes game of hide and seek, where getting caught meant more than just being hit. Mandela also took it upon himself to turn the prison into an informal university, where inmates became both students and teachers. They called it Robben Island University, a place where knowledge was the weapon of choice. Mandela taught history and politics, while others shared their expertise in subjects ranging from economics to languages. It was a subversive act of defiance, turning the oppressive environment into a breeding ground for intellectual growth. And then there were the humorous attempts to keep spirits high. Picture this: Mandela leading his fellow inmates in a mock parliamentary debate, complete with exaggerated gestures and fiery rhetoric. Or the time they staged a mock trial with Mandela as the judge, delivering verdicts with the gravitas of a seasoned jurist, a touch of levity in a place designed to crush hope. Of course, none of this erased the harsh reality of prison life. The food was atrocious, a bland diet that made cardboard look appetizing. Racism was institutionalized, with prisoners divided by race and subjected to different treatment. Black prisoners like Mandela received the worst of it. Yet, despite these indignities, Mandela's resolve never wavered. The absurdity of prison life was often matched by the absurd logic of apartheid itself, a system so outlandish that at times it seemed like a dark parody. But for Mandela, every day on Robben Island was a reminder of the struggle outside, of the millions who still looked to him as a beacon of hope. His ability to endure, to find humor in despair, and to educate others was not just about survival. It was about preparing for the day when freedom would no longer be a distant dream. So, as we wrap up this chapter of Mandela's life, let's not romanticize his time in prison as merely a heroic stand against injustice. It was a grueling test of character, one that revealed Mandela's profound humanity and his capacity to inspire even in the darkest of times. And while the story of Mandela's imprisonment is far from over, it's clear that his legacy was forged not just in the grand gestures, but in the everyday acts of courage and defiance. Stay tuned, because the journey continues, and the best is yet to come. And so, the tale of Nelson Mandela continues as his resilience transformed a bleak prison sentence into a strategic pause in his life's mission. Fast forward to the late 1980s, when South Africa was on the brink of chaos, much like a pressure cooker about to blow its lid. The apartheid regime, with its economy in a downward spiral and international sanctions tightening the noose, realized that a change was not just inevitable, but essential for survival. It was time to talk, enter the clandestine negotiations that would set the stage for Mandela's release. Picture this: a series of secret meetings that would give any spy thriller a run for its money. High-ranking government officials tiptoeing into talks with the very man they had locked away for nearly 3 decades. The irony was thicker than a London fog. These discussions, beginning earnestly in 1985, were like a game of high-stakes poker where each side was trying not to show their hand too soon. The man leading the negotiations on the government's side was none other than Kobe Coetsee, the justice minister at the time. It's worth noting that Coetsee was no bleeding-heart liberal. He was part of the establishment. Yet, even he saw the writing on the wall. South Africa's future lay not in further oppression, but in dialogue and reform. The meetings were held in the utmost secrecy, often in the most mundane settings imaginable, like the dimly lit boardrooms of Pulsemore Prison, where Mandela had been transferred in 1982. Mandela approached these negotiations with the same strategic acumen that had defined his earlier activism. He understood that he was no longer just a prisoner. He was a symbol, a bargaining chip, and a potential leader of a nation on the cusp of dramatic change. But Mandela was nothing if not pragmatic. He knew that to dismantle apartheid, he had to engage with the very people who had perpetuated it. This wasn't some fairy tale where good vanquishes evil with a wave of a wand. It was a gritty, complex dance of politics and power. The tension of these talks was palpable, yet there was also humor, a strange camaraderie that developed between the former adversaries. Mandela, with his trademark charm, often diffused tense moments with a well-timed quip. Imagine the scene, a room full of Sama men in suits, the air thick with the weight of history, suddenly punctuated by Mandela's deep, booming laughter as he recounts a story of prison life. It was this ability to humanize the struggle, to find light in the darkest corners, that made Mandela such a formidable negotiator. By 1990, the winds of change were sweeping across South Africa with the force of a hurricane. On February 11th of that year, Mandela walked free from Victor Verster prison. His image beamed across the globe, a moment that felt like a collective exhale for a world that had held its breath for 27 years. Yet, while the cameras captured the jubilant crowds and the triumph of his release, the real work was just beginning. As Mandela stepped into the role of a free man, he was immediately thrust into the labyrinthine process of dismantling apartheid. This wasn't just about changing laws. It was about transforming a society built on decades of systemic inequality. The task ahead was monumental, akin to turning a cruise ship on a dime. Mandela knew that the transition had to be peaceful, for the alternative was a descent into civil war. Negotiations for a new South Africa began in earnest, leading to the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, CODSA, talks. These were not easy discussions. Imagine trying to fold a fitted sheet while blindfolded, frustrating and seemingly impossible. Yet Mandela persisted, often playing the role of mediator between various factions, each with its own set of demands and grievances. The African National Congress, ANC, wanted a swift transition to majority rule, while the National Party, led by then-President F.W. de Klerk, sought assurances that the rights of minorities would be protected. The negotiations were a roller coaster, filled with moments of hope and despair. There were walkouts, deadlocks, and even violent clashes as conservative forces resisted change. But amidst the chaos, Mandela's steady hand guided the process forward. His ability to empathize, to listen, and to compromise without losing sight of the ultimate goal was nothing short of statesmanship at its finest. It was during this tumultuous period that Mandela's partnership with de Klerk began to take shape. De Klerk, the unlikely ally in this tale of transformation. When he assumed the presidency in 1989, few expected him to be the catalyst for change. Yet, de Klerk recognized the unsustainability of apartheid. His decision to release Mandela and unban the ANC was a bold gamble that paid off, earning him a place in history alongside Mandela. Their relationship, however, was complex. It was a partnership born out of necessity, often fraught with tension and disagreements. Mandela, with his characteristic bluntness, didn't shy away from criticizing de Klerk's government, yet he also acknowledged the courage it took to dismantle a system that had defined the nation for so long. In 1993, the world recognized their joint efforts with the Nobel Peace Prize, a testament to their shared commitment to a peaceful transition. But let's not romanticize this moment as a simple handshake and a pat on the back. The Nobel ceremony was a reminder of the work still to be done, a symbolic gesture that underscored the fragility of the peace they were building. And then, the moment that had seemed impossible for so long, South Africa's first multiracial elections in April 1994. The logistics of this election were mind-boggling. Imagine organizing a national party with 19 million guests, each with their own RSVP. There were challenges aplenty, ballot shortages, long lines, and the looming threat of violence from those opposed to change. But the elections proceeded, a testament to the resilience and determination of a nation ready to redefine itself. On May 10, 1994, under the bright sun of a new era, Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as South Africa's first black president. The ceremony, held at the Union Buildings in Pretoria, was a spectacle of unity and reconciliation. Heads of state, dignitaries, and citizens alike gathered to witness history in the making. Mandela, with his characteristic humility, addressed the nation and the world, emphasizing the need for healing and building a rainbow nation, united in its diversity. But let's not pretend that Mandela's presidency was all rainbows and sunshine. The challenges he faced were immense. Unemployment, poverty, and crime were rampant, and the scars of apartheid were still raw. Mandela's government had to walk a tightrope, addressing the grievances of the past while laying the foundation for a future of equality and prosperity. His policies focused on reconciliation and nation-building, often prioritizing peace over punitive measures. It was a delicate balance, one that required the wisdom of Solomon combined with the patience of a saint. Mandela's presidency was not without its critics. Some felt he was too lenient, too forgiving of those who had upheld apartheid's brutal regime. But Mandela understood that vengeance was a luxury South Africa couldn't afford. Instead, he championed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a groundbreaking initiative aimed at uncovering the truth of apartheid-era atrocities while promoting healing and forgiveness. It was a bold experiment in restorative justice, one that acknowledged the pain of the past while striving to build bridges for the future. As we pause this chapter in Mandela's incredible journey, it's clear that his story is far from over. His presidency set the stage for a new South Africa, a nation grappling with its identity and aspirations. Mandela's legacy is not just one of triumph, but of resilience, a testament to the power of hope and the human spirit. Stay tuned, because the final act of Mandela's life is yet to unfold, and it's a story you won't want to miss. As Mandela's presidency unfolded, the world watched South Africa embark on a journey of reconciliation, healing, and yes, the occasional misstep. Now, leading a country emerging from decades of racial division is no walk in the park. Try juggling a box of fireworks on a windy day, and you might get a sense of the challenges Mandela faced. But he wasn't just the man with a plan. He was the man with a vision of a rainbow nation, where diversity wasn't just tolerated but celebrated. One of Mandela's first acts as president was to set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, in 1995. Now, this wasn't about airing grievances in a group therapy session. The TRC aimed to uncover the ugly truths of apartheid while offering amnesty to those who came clean about their past misdeeds. It was a bold move, like asking a fox to guard the henhouse, but with the hope that the fox might reveal where the eggs went. Under the guidance of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the TRC became a platform for victims and perpetrators to share their stories, often accompanied by a box of tissues and the occasional awkward silence. The TRC hearings were nothing short of a national catharsis, broadcast on TV for all to witness. Imagine flipping through your channels, expecting the usual soap operas, only to stumble upon real-life tales of horror and redemption. It was raw, emotional, and at times overwhelming. But through it all, Mandela stood firm, believing that the path to healing lay in confronting the past head-on, not sweeping it under the rug like yesterday's dust. And let's not forget Mandela's efforts to transform South Africa's image on the global stage. He understood the power of sports as a unifying force, something that transcended politics and prejudice. Cue the 1995 Rugby World Cup, a moment when Mandela donned a green and gold Springbok jersey, embracing a symbol that had once epitomized white supremacy. It was a PR masterstroke, a gesture of goodwill that turned a sporting event into a nation-building exercise. The sight of Mandela, arm in arm with team captain Francois Pienaar, was a visual mic drop, signaling that the country was ready to move forward, one try at a time. But let's inject a bit of realism into this rosy narrative. Mandela's presidency was not all about grand gestures and symbolic victories. South Africa's economy was in dire straits, with unemployment hovering around 20% and a GDP growth rate that was more sluggish than a tortoise on tranquilizers. Mandela's government had to navigate a minefield of economic challenges, balancing the need for redistribution with the realities of a market-driven economy. It was like trying to feed a family of 5 with a single loaf of bread. Everyone had to get a slice, but the crumbs were often all that remained. Critics argued that Mandela's economic policies didn't go far enough in addressing the deep-seated inequalities that apartheid had left behind. The Reconstruction and Development Program, RDP, a cornerstone of his administration, aimed to provide housing, healthcare, and education to the disadvantaged. Yet, the implementation was plagued by bureaucratic red tape and financial constraints. Progress was slow, and the demands were immense, leaving many to question whether the new South Africa was delivering on its promises or merely spinning its wheels in the mud. Amidst these challenges, Mandela's personal life was not without its own dramas. He was, after all, human, a fact that often gets lost in the myth-making. His marriage to Winnie Mandela, once a symbol of resilience, unraveled amidst allegations of infidelity and political discord. Their divorce in 1996 was a reminder that even icons have flaws, that even the most steadfast relationships can buckle under the weight of public scrutiny and personal differences. But let's not dwell on the soap opera aspects of Mandela's life. Instead, let's savor the lighter moments that humanized him. Picture Mandela hosting a state dinner, charming guests with stories of his prison days, or playfully chiding a visiting dignitary over a game of chess. He was known for his infectious laughter, a sound that could melt the iciest of diplomatic frosts. And then there was the time he famously called Queen Elizabeth Roman II, Elizabeth, during a state visit, a breach of protocol that only endeared him further to those who saw the Queen herself chuckle in response. As Mandela's presidency drew to a close in 1999, he opted not to seek a second term, a decision that solidified his legacy as a leader who understood the importance of passing the baton. He had laid the groundwork for a new South Africa, but he knew that the journey was far from over. As he stepped down, his successor, Thabo Mbeki, took the reins, tasked with steering the nation through the next phase of its transformation. Mandela's post-presidency years were marked by continued advocacy and philanthropy. He became a global elder statesman, using his platform to champion causes ranging from HIV/AIDS awareness to conflict resolution in war-torn regions. His foundation, established in 1999, became a beacon for social justice initiatives, embodying the values he had fought for all his life. Yet, even as Mandela's legend grew, so too did the myths surrounding him. It's easy to paint him as a flawless hero, as a saintly figure whose every action was guided by moral perfection. But the truth is, Mandela was a man, a remarkable one, no doubt, but a man nonetheless. He made mistakes, faced criticism, and grappled with the complexities of leadership in a deeply divided society. It's this duality, his humanity and his heroism, that makes his story so compelling. So, as we reflect on Mandela's legacy, let's embrace both the myth and the reality. Let's celebrate the icon who inspired millions with his courage and conviction, while acknowledging the man who faced the same struggles and doubts as the rest of us. Mandela's life is a testament to the power of resilience, to the idea that one person, armed with an unwavering spirit and a vision for change, can indeed make a difference. In the end, Mandela's story is not just about the triumph over apartheid or the creation of a democratic South Africa. It's about the enduring human spirit, the capacity for forgiveness, and the relentless pursuit of justice. His journey reminds us that while history may be written by the victors, it's shaped by those who dare to defy the odds, those who refuse to accept the world as it is, and instead strive for what it could be. And so, as we close the book on this chapter of history, let's carry forward Mandela's legacy, not as a relic of the past, but as a living testament to the power of hope and the possibility of change. Because in the grand narrative of human progress, Mandela's story is a reminder that the fight for justice is never truly over, and that the most profound legacies are those that inspire us to keep pushing forward, one step, one struggle, and one triumph at a time. In the cacophony of medieval towns, the rise of guilds was as understated as a rock concert in the middle of a monastery. Emerging in the 11th century, these guilds were the original trade unions, a mix of mercantile muscle and artisan artistry, setting the stage for medieval economic theater. But before you get misty-eyed picturing a cozy coterie of craftsmen swapping tips on tapestry, weaving over mugs of mead, let's peel back the velvet curtain and take a gander at what really went down. The guilds were born out of necessity, much like a college student's ramen diet. As Europe's population ballooned and trade networks spread like a medieval Twitter feed, craftsmen and traders needed a way to protect their interests. Enter the guilds, which, contrary to popular belief, weren't just quaint little clubs. They were more like exclusive societies with a bit of a velvet rope situation. Think Studio 54, but with more wool and fewer disco balls. Membership came with a price. In fact, it was like trying to join the world's most exclusive golf club, but with the potential for far less sunburn. A craftsman had to pay a hefty entrance fee, sometimes equivalent to several months' wages. This wasn't pocket change. It was a serious investment. And once you were in, you were subjected to a hierarchy that would make any modern corporate ladder seem like a kiddie slide. At the bottom rung, you had the apprentices, poor souls who paid their dues, quite literally, by working for free or close enough to it. These were the wide-eyed newcomers, often boys as young as 12, who were essentially the medieval version of unpaid interns. They signed up for years under the watchful eye of a master, learning the trade, which was about as glamorous as it sounds. Apprenticeships could last anywhere from 2 to 10 years, depending on the complexity of the craft. It was a long haul, but hey, at least they weren't fetching coffee. As they graduated to journeymen, they could finally earn wages, though these were often meager. Journeymen wandered from town to town, plying their trade, hence the name. They were the medieval gig workers, hustling to make a living while dreaming of becoming masters someday. If they played their cards right, crafted a masterpiece, and paid another, you guessed it, fee, they could eventually join the ranks of the masters. Masters were the top-tier players, the CEOs of medieval trade. They ran their own workshops, trained apprentices, and crucially, held the trade secrets that were as closely guarded as your grandma's secret cookie recipe. These secrets weren't just trivial. They were the competitive edge that kept the guilds in control. Whether it was a unique dyeing technique or a special way to temper steel, these were the golden tickets to economic success. Guilds didn't just sit around making pretty things, though. They wielded real power in medieval towns. They set the rules, from pricing and quality standards to working conditions and market access. Want to sell your goods in town? You better play by the guild's rules or face the medieval version of a cease and desist. They also had a hand in civic matters, often involved in local politics, guild members sometimes serving on town councils. Talk about having your fingers in all the pies, or should I say pasties. Yet, for all their influence, guilds weren't always the benevolent protectors of crafts and trades. They could be exclusive and restrictive, often keeping women and outsiders at bay. Most guilds were men-only, clubs, with women typically relegated to lesser roles or banned altogether. And if you weren't from the right family or didn't have the right connections, good luck climbing the guild hierarchy. It's tempting to romanticize guilds as brotherhoods of talented artisans, but the reality was more cutthroat. They were about as warm and fuzzy as a porcupine in a snowstorm. Sure, they fostered community and collaboration, but they also guarded their turf with the ferocity of a dragon sitting on a pile of gold. In a world where survival often depended on who you knew as much as what you made, guilds were both a blessing and a curse. Despite these gritty details, the allure of guilds persists. Perhaps it's the idea of craftsmanship and pride in one's work that strikes a chord in our mass-produced world. Or maybe it's the nostalgia for a time when a job was for life, not just for until the next layoff. Whatever the case, guilds were a vital cog in the medieval machine, simultaneously a stabilizing force and a barrier to progress. As we delve deeper into the world they shaped, keep in mind that while the guilds were indeed the architects of their age, they were also its gatekeepers, holding the keys to both opportunity and obstruction. And so, guilds were the architects and the gatekeepers of their age, a balancing act more precarious than a juggler on a unicycle. But let's dive into the nitty-gritty of guild life, a world where the concept of a 9-to-5 job would be met with a bewildered stare and a hearty chuckle. In reality, the medieval workday was more like a sunrise-to-sunset marathon, where the only overtime pay was the satisfaction of not starving. The guilds didn't just slap a logo on a product and call it a day. Oh no, they were the original quality control freaks, the medieval equivalent of a micromanaging boss with a penchant for red pens. Every piece of work had to meet exacting standards. Imagine a world where your loaf of bread had to be precisely the right weight, or your tapestry just the right number of threads per inch. Slip up, and the guild might smack you with a fine that would make modern parking tickets look like chump change. Pricing was another arena where guilds flexed their muscles. Forget about a free market. This was more like an exclusive club's price list. Guild members couldn't just slap a price tag on their products based on whim or desperation. Prices were meticulously regulated, ensuring nobody undersold the competition. It was a medieval version of price fixing, with a twist of community spirit, or perhaps a chokehold on innovation, depending on your perspective. However, these regulations weren't just about keeping everyone in line. They also served a higher purpose. The guild's rules were designed to maintain order in an otherwise chaotic medieval marketplace, a place where bartering could quickly turn into barroom brawls. By controlling quality and prices, guilds ensured that their members could earn a decent living without the market collapsing into a cutthroat free-for-all. They were the unsung heroes, or villains, depending on how you felt about restrictive trade practices, of economic stability. And speaking of stability, guilds were political powerhouses. They were the medieval equivalent of corporate lobbyists, wielding influence in city politics like a knight wielding a sword, often bluntly and with considerable force. Guilds could sway town councils, influence laws, and even decide who got to set up sharp ware. They were the puppet masters of their time, pulling strings with the deftness of a seasoned marionette artist. Their political clout was reflected in the pageantry of their gatherings, which were less about work and more about who could out-feast who. Imagine a networking event where the real business was conducted over tankards of ale and platters of roasted meats. These were feasts that could put modern corporate lunches to shame, with enough food and drink to make even the most gluttonous Roman emperor envious. And while the feasts were about camaraderie and networking, they were also a display of power. The bigger the feast, the more influence you wielded. It was medieval social media, roasted boar instead of Instagram likes. Of course, the guild's influence wasn't always benevolent. While they could ensure fair pay and quality goods, they could also stifle competition and innovation, keeping outsiders firmly outside. It was a world where who you knew was often more important than what you could do. And while this exclusivity helped maintain standards, it also meant that the guilds could be as welcoming as a porcupine with a migraine. Yet, despite their flaws, guilds provided a sense of community and security in a world that was often anything but. For many, guild membership was a ticket to a stable life, a way to ensure that your craft, and by extension, your livelihood, was protected. They were the medieval safety net, catching craftsmen and traders in a web of rules and traditions that, while restrictive, offered a measure of certainty in an uncertain world. So while the myth of the guild as a cozy community of craftsmen isn't entirely accurate, it's easy to see why the allure persists. There's something undeniably appealing about the idea of a world where skill and craftsmanship are valued, where a job is more than just a paycheck, it's a calling. But as we peel back the layers of history, it's clear that the reality of guild life was as complex and multifaceted as the medieval world itself. As we continue to explore this fascinating period, let's keep in mind that while guilds were indeed the architects of their age, they were also the sentinels, standing guard over a world that was as much about preserving the past as it was about shaping the future. In the bustling tapestry of medieval life, guilds threaded their way into the economic fabric with the subtlety of a marching band at a silent disco. They held the medieval marketplace in a vice grip, and while the romantic vision of guilds nurturing local economies paints a charming picture, the reality is somewhat less idyllic. Think of guilds as the medieval version of a heavyweight boxing promoter, controlling, calculating, and not above throwing a few elbows to maintain dominance. Let's talk numbers, shall we? Joining a guild wasn't just a matter of signing up and grabbing a membership card. It was more like buying into an elite club, where the initiation fee could run anywhere from a few shillings to a sum equivalent to several months' earnings. Picture dropping $2,000 just to get your foot in the door. And if you thought that was the end of your financial woes, think again. Guilds imposed annual fees, fines for infractions, and even demanded payments for the privilege of setting up shop. It was a fiscal obstacle course that would make even a modern IRS agent blush with admiration. But why all the fees? Well, guilds provided services that were essential for a tradesman's survival in the cutthroat world of medieval commerce. They negotiated trade tariffs, ensuring members weren't gouged by local lords or foreign merchants. Imagine trying to get your goods through customs without the guild's stamp of approval. It was a bit like trying to board a flight with a suitcase full of liquids. Moreover, Guilds had the power to influence tariffs, which were taxes on goods crossing borders. They often secured favorable rates for their members, a perk that non-members could only dream of while grumbling into their ale. For all their monopolistic tendencies, guilds did support local economies, at least when it suited them. By enforcing strict quality controls and price regulations, they maintained a level of economic stability. They were the medieval market's quality control department, ensuring that a shoemaker wasn't passing off cheap sandals as bespoke leather creations. Of course, this also meant that innovation was stifled faster than a new song at a medieval tavern if it didn't meet guild approval. Let's not sugarcoat it. Guilds were the original market manipulators. They had the power to dictate who could sell what, where, and for how much. If you weren't a guild member, you might find your goods languishing in the back alleys of the marketplace, overshadowed by the guild-approved merchandise on prime display. It was a world where market access was less about the quality of your craft and more about the size of your membership dues. The guild's influence extended into the political sphere, too, where they wielded their power with the finesse of a sledgehammer. They could sway local governance, ensuring laws favored their interests and kept competition at bay. In many towns, guild members held positions on councils, making decisions that impacted everything from market regulations to infrastructure projects. It was a bit like letting the Farks guard the henhouse, if by Farks you mean a group of highly organized tradesmen, and by henhouse you mean the entire local economy. Still, despite their Machiavellian machinations, guilds weren't entirely the villains of the piece. They offered a semblance of security in an unpredictable world. Membership meant protection, not just from economic ruin, but from the kind of medieval justice that could be as erratic as a knight's aim after a night in the tavern. Guilds could mediate disputes, ensuring members weren't left to the whims of feuding lords or rival merchants. They were a shield, albeit one that came with a hefty price tag. But let's not get too caught up in the economics without acknowledging the social dynamics at play. Guilds were bastions of male dominance, often excluding women from full membership. Women could participate in certain trades, but they were typically relegated to roles that didn't threaten the male hierarchy. It was a boys' club with a strict dress code, where the glass ceiling was more like a stone fortress. Despite their exclusivity, guilds did foster a sense of community among their members, a fraternity of sorts, bound by shared interests and mutual benefit. It was a network where relationships mattered as much as craftsmanship, where knowing the right people could open doors that skill alone couldn't. In this respect, guilds were both a relic of the past and a precursor to modern professional networks, where who you know can still trump what you know. As we delve deeper into the economic impact of guilds, it becomes clear that they were both architects and adversaries of progress. They sustained local economies by maintaining order and quality, yet their monopolistic grip stifled competition and innovation. It's a paradox that underscores the complexity of medieval trade, a world where the lines between ally and adversary were as blurred as the ink on a scribe's parchment. So, as we continue unraveling the threads of guild history, let's remember that while they provided stability in a tumultuous era, they also perpetuated systems that were as exclusive as they were essential. Guilds were the gatekeepers of their age, holding the keys to both prosperity and exclusion. And in the medieval marketplace, those keys were worth their weight in gold, or at least in a decent set of iron tools. As the medieval world tiptoed, or perhaps stumbled, into the late 14th century, the guilds found themselves at a crossroads that would make even the most decisive medieval king break into a cold sweat. For centuries, guilds had been the masters of their domains, the undisputed overlords of trade and craftsmanship. But a perfect storm of economic shifts, technological advancements, and one particularly nasty pandemic threatened to topple their meticulously constructed thrones. First, let's talk trade shifts. By the 15th century, trade routes were spreading like rumors at a royal court, stretching across continents and oceans. The opening of new trade routes to Asia and the Americas was like handing a medieval merchant a treasure map with a big, fat X marking the spot. Suddenly, exotic goods were flooding European markets, silks, spices, and precious metals that made the local guild-approved wares look about as appealing as day-old porridge. This global marketplace was a boon for merchants, but for guilds, It was like watching a rival knight waltz off with your lady love. As capitalism began to rear its ambitious head, the guild's monopoly on production started to unravel. Early capitalist ventures, proto-corporations, if you will, were the cool new kids on the block, ditching the guild's intricate hierarchy for a more streamlined, profit-driven approach. Think of these early corporations as the medieval equivalent of a tech startup, complete with their own set of disruptors and visionary leaders. They bypassed the guild system by employing workers outside the traditional apprenticeship model, paying wages directly, and investing in mass production methods. It was like trading in a horse-drawn cart for a shiny new carriage. Faster, more efficient, and a whole lot more lucrative. Technological advancements also threw a spanner in the works. The invention of the spinning wheel in the 14th century made textile production faster and cheaper, threatening the guild's tight grip on quality and pricing. And don't even get me started on the printing press, which Johannes Gutenberg unleashed upon the world in the mid-15th century. This contraption didn't just revolutionize communication, it democratized knowledge, making it harder for guilds to keep their trade secrets under lock and key. It was as if the guilds had been hoarding the only copy of a bestseller, only to find it suddenly available at every medieval newsstand. But let's not forget the Black Death, that infamous 14th century party crasher. This pandemic swept through Europe with all the subtlety of a battering ram, wiping out an estimated 25 to 30 million people, about a third of the continent's population. The labor shortage that followed meant that workers, for once, had the upper hand. Laborers could demand higher wages and better conditions, and the traditional guild model, with its rigid structure and long apprenticeships, suddenly seemed as appealing as a leaky thatched roof in a rainstorm. The plague also had a less talked about but equally significant impact. It shattered the social fabric that guilds had woven so carefully. With entire communities decimated, the close-knit networks that had underpinned guild power began to fray. It was every craftsman for himself, and many turned to the burgeoning capitalist model as a lifeline. As guilds clung to their old ways, early corporations embraced innovation with the enthusiasm of children in a sweet shop. The Medici family, for instance, transformed banking into a fine art, creating a financial empire that would make modern hedge fund managers green with envy. Their bank, established in the late 14th century, was a trailblazer in using letters of credit, which made trade easier and more secure, a stark contrast to the guilds' increasingly outdated methods. Yet, even as guilds were outpaced by these nimble new business models, they didn't go down without a fight. They attempted to adapt, expanding their influence into new industries and adjusting their regulations to accommodate changing times. Some even dabbled in the wool trade, which was booming thanks to those newfangled spinning wheels. But these efforts often felt like applying a band-aid to a gaping wound. Despite their struggles, guilds did leave a lasting legacy. Their emphasis on quality and craftsmanship set standards that persisted long after their decline. And while they might have been as welcoming as a grizzly bear to innovation, they did manage to instill a sense of pride and dignity in work that resonates to this day. They were the precursors to modern trade unions, and their fingerprints can be seen in everything from labor laws to professional certifications. So, as we close this chapter on the decline of guilds, remember that while their power may have waned, their impact on history is undeniable. They were the architects of their own downfall in many ways, but they also laid the groundwork for the economic systems that followed. As we move forward, we'll delve into how these changes continue to shape the medieval world, setting the stage for a new era of economic and social transformation. Stay tuned, because the story of how we got from there to here is anything but straightforward. As we move forward, we'll delve into how these changes continue to shape the medieval world, setting the stage for a new era of economic and social transformation. Stay tuned, because the story of how we got from there to here is anything but straightforward. The legacy of medieval guilds, like an ancient tapestry, is woven into the fabric of today's economic structures, and boy, is it a mixed bag. On one hand, guilds were the original brand ambassadors of quality control, ensuring that a shoemaker's wares didn't fall apart faster than a reality TV star's marriage. This emphasis on quality set a precedent that echoes in modern professional standards and certifications. In a way, guilds were the granddaddies of today's trade unions and professional associations, but let's not get too misty-eyed just yet. For one, guilds were about as inclusive as an exclusive yacht club. They were a fortress of privilege, where membership was a gateway to economic stability, provided you had the right connections and a hefty purse. Fast forward to the present, and we see trade unions and professional associations striving for inclusivity, advocating for workers' rights, and championing diversity. Yet, these modern entities still share the guild's knack for organization and collective bargaining. Today's unions are the torchbearers of worker solidarity, much like guilds were the marshals of medieval trade. But here's where the plot thickens. The guild's obsession with maintaining the status quo often stifled innovation, much like the bureaucratic red tape that can bind modern institutions. Imagine trying to launch a startup in a world where guilds held the reins. It'd be like trying to fly a kite in a hurricane. Similarly, while today's unions play a crucial role in protecting workers, they sometimes face criticism for being slow to adapt to new industries and technologies. The balancing act between protection and progress is a tale as old as time, and it seems we're still performing the same dance, albeit with different partners. Now, let's tackle the nostalgia for the so-called good old days of guilds, a sentiment as enduring as a medieval ballad sung by a bard with a penchant for exaggeration. Yes, the idea of a community of skilled artisans sounds delightful, but the reality was often less rosy. The guild's exclusivity and hierarchical rigidity were barriers as solid as a castle wall, and the romanticized notion of guilds as tight-knit communities overlooks their less savory aspects, like rampant nepotism and power plays that would make Game of Thrones look like a tea party. In today's economic landscape, there's a similar yearning for stability and job security, understandable given the gig economy's rise and the shifting sands of modern employment. But let's not forget that the security offered by guilds came at a steep price, both literally and figuratively. The guild's version of job security was contingent on adherence to their rules and regulations, a system that was as protective as it was repressive. Modern workers might crave the stability of guilds, but I doubt they'd relish the restrictive environment. As we wrap up this trip through time, it's clear that while much has changed in the world of work, some things remain stubbornly the same. The guild's legacy is a double-edged sword. On one side, they laid the groundwork for professional standards and collective bargaining. On the other, they exemplified the pitfalls of exclusivity and resistance to change. Today's unions and professional associations carry the torch forward, navigating the same challenges in a world that's as unpredictable as a medieval festival. So, what's the takeaway from our journey through the annals of guild history? Perhaps it's that human nature is a constant, with our drive for community, security, and progress shaping our economic structures throughout the ages. Guilds were the architects and gatekeepers of their time, and their legacy is a testament to the complexities of balancing tradition and innovation. As we look to the future, perhaps we can learn from the guild's triumphs and missteps, crafting a world of work that embraces both excellence and inclusivity. In the end, the story of guilds is a reminder that history is less a linear path and more a winding road, full of twists, turns, and the occasional pothole. As we navigate our own economic landscape, let's keep an eye on the rearview mirror, not to live in the past, but to understand it, because the lessons of history are more than just echoes. They're the foundation upon which we build our future. And who knows, with a little luck and a lot of determination, we might just forge a path that honors the best of the past while blazing trails into the future.